Los Angeles Times, and thank you for joining us tonight. We will be watching President Biden's State of the Union address coming up in just about an hour. It's his first as president, and of course it is happening at a very anxious moment. The president took office, of course, promising to halt the COVID-19 pandemic, to improve the economy, and heal the partisan divide. Now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine underway, he has quite the balancing act to strike tonight. With the upcoming midterm elections just 9 months away, the stakes could not be higher for the president and the Democratic Party. During the next hour, we will set the stage for the speech with reporters and experts who will help us assess the stakes tonight for the country and for Californians in particular. And with that, let me welcome two colleagues from the Los Angeles Times. We have Seema Mehta, who covers politics. Thank you for being here. And columnist Gustavo Arellano, a veteran of these live streams. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Really great to have you.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Seema, what are you looking for? You've watched a lot of State of the Unions over the years. This is President Biden's first. What are you looking for from him tonight?
I think there are three main things that that he's going to be focused on that Americans really want to hear about. Number one, what's happening in Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot of agreement. I mean, there's a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainians. There's a lot of anger at the Russians. But I think the question is, how far is the United States willing to go? Obviously, we've given them lots of equipment. I think we just signed off on another $350 billion worth. So the question is, how much is he going to urge NATO? I mean, what is America's role in this attempt to stop Putin? Secondly, inflation. Americans are hugely concerned about inflation. You're seeing it at the gas pump. You're seeing it at the grocery store. How is he planning to stop that? And thirdly, the pandemic. I mean, it seems like we're maybe reaching the end of it, but people are still really angry. I mean, there's a number of the mask regulations are being reduced, but I think is this the new normal?
Hugely consequential things, and not easy to wrap them all together in one cohesive speech. Gustavo, what are you looking for, especially sort of from California perspective, maybe?
Climate change right now. I mean, December and January, there were some of the snowiest, wettest months on record in California, and now we're back on drought again. And so, Biden has talked about climate change in the past, especially in doing a green energy push, Build Back Better. So that's one big thing. Also, gas prices here in California. Already we have a gas station, I believe, near West Hollywood, $6 a gallon. In California, we love to drive, so we got to focus on that. And one thing that would be interesting, he's not going to talk about it tonight, but it's obviously on the minds of a lot of Californians, crime. Whether you think it's rising or not, I doubt Biden's going to ask for it or going to talk about it, but who knows? We'll see.
I think it's interesting, too, you mentioned climate change. We talked with some Republican lawmakers. We'll hear from them a little bit later. But they are really keying in on what's happening in Ukraine with gas prices to make a push for more energy production at home. And we're not talking about renewables, obviously, in this case. We're talking about oil and natural gas. And so, that is another interesting dynamic here, is that they see an opening on that as well.
They'll totally tie it to Ukraine. We got to get more oil. We got to do more fracking. Look at what happens when we're too reliant on one country. But that's not going to be the answer that Biden's going to go for. He's all about renewables, and the Democratic Party is definitely not going to push for him. But here in California, where we are leading in terms of renewables, where we are also leading in terms of stopping fracking and not doing oil, that's one thing that Californians are intensely interested in.
Well, and the administration's big push on climate was going to be in that Build Back Better bill, which was totally, went off a cliff at the end of the year. $550 billion basically in market incentives to transition to cleaner fuels. I don't know that we're going to hear a lot about that, but there are a lot of activists out there who probably are hoping to hear a plan for reviving.
And I suspect, Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, she's going to offer a sort of Democratic rebuttal, and she's obviously one of the more liberal members of Congress. And I wonder if she brings up, those types of issues how much of a divide she paints between sort of her wing of the party and versus Biden's sort of more centrist wing.
I mean, that is one of the interesting things to watch, is how because we've been watching this his entire presidency, how he navigates just the dynamics in his own party, trying to make sure that you have somebody like Joe Manchin in the fold, who represents a state Donald Trump won by 40 points, and also satisfying that very loud progressive wing of the party, the AOCs, the Rashida Tlaibs, who want really, more bolder action on climate and a host of other things.
He's going to have to weave a thread like never before. I know it's a mixed metaphor, but that's literally how hard it is for him, that he's going to have to placate both sides of his party and try to get Republicans to sign on with him at a time where we have COVID fatigue and Ukraine is on everyone's mind. So, I mean, has there ever been a State of the Union like this with so many moving parts.
I mean, it's really difficult to compare it to, I mean, we have domestic issues, we have foreign issues. But the other thing I'm curious about is how Republicans respond to it, because often when there's crisis overseas, you tend to, the politics are supposed to stop at, at our shore. And we've seen this with the Republican Party. We've seen a couple different reactions. We do see from the leadership, some, really talking tough on Putin and not going after President Biden. Then you have some people in the middle who are saying this is, not in the middle, this is another wing of the Republican Party who are saying that this is the fault of President Biden for being overly weak, while also still going after Putin. And then you have a smaller number of people, but we saw them this weekend at this conference in Florida who were cheering for Putin. So I'm really interested to see how the Republicans react to especially his foreign policy remarks.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about it. The backdrop to tonight's big address in Washington is clearly the war in Ukraine, where Russia's aerial assault continues to pummel major cities, even though the Pentagon says now that Russian convoys on the ground have been somewhat stuck over the last 24 hours or so. The White House also released a couple excerpts from the president's expected remarks tonight. One of them focuses on Ukraine. The president plans to say, quote, "Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos." And he will try to explain the importance, we're told, of a united transatlantic alliance, saying also, quote, he thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond, he being Vladimir Putin. And he thought he could divide us here at home. Putin was wrong. We were ready. Again, those are from excerpts of the president's speech that the White House put out just a couple hours ago. It is now just after 3 a.m. in Kyiv, Ukraine's capital city. And let's take a live look at that city along with a few other cities in Ukraine. You'll take a look at the camera, I believe. We have a grid of cameras here, and you'll see a quiet evening for the time, at least according to those cameras. Can't see everything, but it is just after 3 a.m. Several of those shots, if you look closely, are of the capital city, Kyiv. Others from other parts of the country, Lviv. Again, we'll keep a close eye on those shots. We'll let you know if anything dramatic pops up there. Now, earlier today, I spoke with freelance journalist Oz Katerji, who has been in Kyiv for the past 2 weeks. Take a listen. Oz, thank you so much for joining us from Kyiv, where you've been reporting for the last several days throughout this conflict. Tell us what you've seen in the last several hours as you've been out.
Yeah, so this morning we came out of curfew, and the first thing I did was I wanted to get to the shops to see what the situation was, try and get some food. When I got there, there were a few more shops open than there have been the last couple of days. However, food is running really scarce now. The shelves are bare. There are really long queues to get bread, queues to get basic supplies. And at the moment, these shops have no way of restocking. And, imagine yourself right in the heart of the central business district of a major city. It's not like there's a farm or a tree or anything nearby that you could eat. If there isn't food in the shops, there's no restaurants, no coffee shops, no hotels, no bars, no cafes, there's nothing. So the only option is these grocers that are open with skeleton staff that are running really low on food. The problem is that Kyiv could soon be a city under siege, and if its supply lines aren't restored, strengthened, people here are going to start suffering humanitarian consequences very, very quickly, very quickly. Throughout the day, I spent most of the day out on the streets. As I was coming home, there was a very, very large explosion. And that turned out to be the attack on the TV tower by the Russian military attacked Kyiv's TV tower. And in doing so, they also attacked the Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Memorial Site, which is absolutely shocking. And a family of 5 were killed in the blast. So Russia is targeting civilian infrastructure and Holocaust memorial sites here in the heart of Kyiv.
It's been several days of this, and there has been some optimism, I think, in Washington, other places, with Ukraine's ability so far to withstand the attack, at least in terms of not allowing the Russian forces to take over any major Ukrainian cities. But obviously, several days of conflict takes its toll. Are folks getting a little more harried there as supplies run low and as nerves continue to fray with the constant shelling?
I'll be honest, very honest. No, I haven't seen a shift, not in the way that people have been. The people have been kind, caring, resilient, stoic. I can't praise the people of this beautiful, wonderful city enough for how they're reacting to this atrocious situation that they're being thrown into against their will. They've had a gun against their head for a best part of a year, and now they're not even being threatened with invasion. They've been invaded by a revanchist fascist dictatorship, hell bent on killing them and breaking their population and installing a client regime to rule over them. It's terrifying, but I don't see people terrified. I see people acting with dignity and bravery and looking out for each other. The worry is that as people start to starve, that this situation just deteriorates. Society is only really kept together by, by very, very, not very tightly bound threads. And if those threads start to unravel, things fall apart quickly. And I really don't want to see that happen here. And the thing is, we have warnings. We're warning people with enough time. Governments can act, should act. They need to start preparing planes to start delivering aid here. If that puts some military planes in the firing line of the Russian military, I think that's a decision that has to be made very quickly. If the city gets cut off and besieged, we're not currently cut off and besieged, but those supply lines still aren't coming in, so that needs to be sorted out. We know what Russia's going to do. Russia's going to cut off millions of civilians, and it's going to bomb them, and it's going to try and starve them into submission. So the US government has a choice now, which is either it sanctions this, it allows it, or it tries to stop it. Those are the only two options that they have. Those are the only two options. Either they say they allow this to happen, or they try and stop it from happening. And people are going to starve here in Kiev without international assistance.
That's freelance journalist Oz Katerji on the ground in Kiev earlier today. Now let's bring in Jane Harman, former Democratic member of Congress and former president of the Brennan Center. Welcome, Representative Harman. I want to start with what we just heard, that emotional plea almost from Oz Katerji for more intervention in Ukraine. And it's certainly understandable from anyone who's witnessing what is happening firsthand, innocent people being bombed and shot at, causing people around the world to wonder why the West's defense of democracies may seem to only go as far as its treaty obligations. I know there is a clear explanation, though, for why we are not willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Can you explain a little more about that?
Well, I'm wearing my Ukraine colors, and I was on the Maidan in 2014 when the monuments were erected to those who brought down the puppet government that Russia used to run in Ukraine. Never underestimate the Ukrainian heart. I mean, what you're hearing here is people massively outgunned and outplaned and all that, fighting back and not giving in. And I understand the point about boots on the ground. It is something President Biden promised after our endless wars, and it's not clear Americans would support it. But I would say, and this will be the center point of his speech tonight, the tagline of which is building a better America, that American moral global leadership is back, and that we have forged an alliance with partners and allies, which has introduced stringent economic sanctions and enormously severe other consequences for Russia, which are sadly hurting the Russian people, but mostly hurting the Russian kleptocrats, which will have bite in this week. And I think that plus the humanitarian lines on the ground that are going into the country and the defensive weapons being introduced by a coalition of the EU, NATO, and the US will offer the kind of protection that was just called for in your last segment. And let me add, too, though, that Biden's speech will focus on Ukraine first, but it also will deal with his economic vision. And there has been progress, first of all, on jobs. There's progress on inflation, not enough, but it's a work in progress. And the infrastructure bill already passed on a bipartisan basis should offer some real final modernization of America's sad infrastructure. But on COVID, we're turning the corner. And finally, this wasn't mentioned, Biden has nominated the first woman Supreme Court justice who happens to be Black in Ketanji Jackson. And she is an excellent pick. And I think that will really inspire people around the country to understand that our agenda is changing.
You've kind of covered the waterfront for us in terms of what we're expecting in this speech. I guess the question is, given where things are, you mentioned the infrastructure bill. We know that people have a lot of concerns about the cost of goods and inflation, but the jobs numbers are very good. The unemployment is down. But, the president has not gotten the Build Back Better agenda through. Voting rights, no action there. You mentioned the Supreme Court. When you take everything on the whole, I know we have some time before the midterms. No one really knows what the world is going to look like in the fall. But right now, do you feel like Democrats broadly are satisfied with what they've gotten out of this presidency?
No, I don't think most people are satisfied. Being president's one tough job. The poll numbers are not good yet. Wrong direction numbers are high. Biden's approval rating is below 40%. Lots of Democrats are pretty worried about midterms, but it's very early. Having served 9 terms in Congress, this stuff comes down to the last month or so. And over this period of time, I think American leadership, finally reestablished in the world, is going to change some hearts and minds. Plus, the infrastructure bill that already passed is going to help real people. I don't know what else Congress will be able to pass. I also worry about inflation, and I frankly worry about the debt and deficit, which many of us do. And so I hope Congress will do more. There's a push to do more. But in the meantime, I think that the agenda that we have, turning the corner on COVID, an economic vision that is building jobs, America's global leadership restored, and the nomination of this very impressive Black woman to the Supreme Court mean a lot and will help Biden a lot.
You've obviously studied foreign policy for decades, and you're an expert in that area. We've seen a number of people sort of question how far Putin is willing to go, and also suggest people in both parties, whether it's Senator Rubio or former Ambassador McFaul, suggest that this Putin is not the same as he was 5 years ago, that he's acting less predictably, maybe less rationally. What do you think of somebody who's watched him for so many years?
Well, I think that's true. I think he's a bully, and I think he may be cornered, and that could explain the really bad and reckless behavior that he's exhibiting. I'm not a psychologist. I can't really say. I heard Speaker Pelosi just say that he might be unhinged. But I think it's more important to figure out a set of tactics against behavior we are trying to predict that would be useful. And I think we have those. And I think we're going as far as our allies and we can agree to go. And having the entire world, let's understand, the Swiss are now preventing assets in its banks from being removed. That's huge. And most countries, no country in the world has joined with Russia in voting with it in the UN. So that's good too. China is still, we think, connected to Russia, but I'm sure President Xi is having second thoughts about Putin's behavior. So this is an existential moment. And the good news, as far as I'm concerned, is that President Biden is stepping up to meet this moment.
Well, and certainly by uniting all the allies, against Russia, one of the things that he takes away from Putin is a binary, but bilateral situation that's just about the United States and Russia. If there's strength in numbers, it seems like the West has those numbers. We're going to keep watching it. We'll leave our conversation there, but Representative Harman, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate getting your thoughts on the State of the Union address.
Well, thank you. I miss being home. Take care.
All right, thanks very much. Well, as we were talking about, veiled threats of nuclear war from Russia are adding another order of magnitude to President Biden's national security challenges and another layer of anxiety for people all around the world. Earlier today, I spoke with Representative John Garamendi, a California Democrat and a member of the House Committee on Armed Services, where he chairs a subcommittee on military readiness. I spoke with him just before he entered a classified meeting on nuclear issues. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us on a busy day. We really appreciate your time. You're attending a classified briefing today related to nuclear issues. And I just want to start by asking you about the risk. If you can assess the risk right now of Russia and President Vladimir Putin actually engaging in some kind of nuclear conflict at this point.
It's certainly a risk. In fact, there's a day-to-day, minute-to-minute risk that we've been living with for the last 50 years. Now, what Putin is probably talking about is the threat of his tactical nuclear weapons being used in Eastern Europe to somehow stop the Ukrainian military. This makes no sense whatsoever. So I think what he's really trying to do here is to use his nuclear threat to back off NATO, European Union, and most every other country in the world that is putting sanctions on him, his oligarch friends, and his economy.
There's been such a swift and strong response, a unified response from Washington and from across Europe once the attacks started. It seems like the Allies are doing everything they can, in spite of this nuclear threat, to bolster Ukraine, even though for the US and for NATO, it seems pretty clear at this point that putting boots on the ground, involving ourselves militarily, is this something that cannot happen, and that is also because of the nuclear threat. Is that right?
Putting boots on the ground or in the air over Ukraine in this war requires a declaration of Congress, an authorization to use military force, or a declaration of war. They're one and the same. The president does not have the power to do this on his own. Now, if the United States or a NATO country is attacked, then that is defensive. And the president has the power to defend, but does not have the power to engage militarily in Ukraine.
And that's Congressman John Garamendi of California, who I spoke with earlier today. Of course, the big X factor in all of this is Vladimir Putin himself, who ordered the invasion of Ukraine, and of course, whose nuclear threats are now forcing a very difficult question: how far he may actually take this. Here to help us understand the mind of Putin a little better and other autocratic leaders through history is New York University professor Ruth Ben-Gayat. She is the author of Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. Really appreciate it. Been looking forward to this conversation. In your epilogue to your book, you singled out Putin as being vulnerable. Can you tell everybody watching what you mean by that?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So, I think that part of the reason Putin undertook this, reckless invasion is that he was already feeling that the winds were shifting, that he was at the peak of his power, and what he's needed to do is use more repression, more disinformation. He's been there for 22 years. His kleptocracy is not sustainable. He really has the most complete kleptocracy of anybody since Gaddafi in Libya. And there's a whole new generation that's been protesting in greater numbers. And there was a poll a year ago that almost 50% of Russians aged 18 to 24 thought that Russia is going in the wrong direction. So when you have intimations of your power drifting away, then he's got to also, lock up Alexei Navalny. He has to game the system basically. He can't have any free elections. So the autocrats start to get consumed by their place in history, delusions of grandeur. And so he's been giving these speeches about history. And, he wants to have this imperial grandeur and recapturing some version of the Soviet Union. And so it's a very bad situation when autocrats get into that space, because they make mistakes, because they're not listening to, they don't have any critics around them. They only have flatterers. And this is when, over and over again, from Mussolini onward, they have done things that they've miscalculated, and it's caused disaster.
we've seen him kind of nipping around the edges of the former Soviet Union for years. If this is a miscalculation going too far, and you think it results potentially from some change in Putin, some growing isolation, have you seen anything in particular that has given you more confidence that this is a guy who's just totally cut off and isolated and is not getting any sort of feedback or any pushback from anybody around him?
Well, we've been seeing these photographs of him sitting at these ridiculously long tables, and he doesn't normally do that with such frequency. And so when I saw those, I thought, "Uh-oh, he's isolated." And it really is it's like a toll of autocratic rule, because what happens is that the longer they're in power, the more they get paranoid, the more they fear betrayal by those around them. So they start isolating themselves, and often they kick out people who are more objective, and they have like just family members and flatterers around them. There's usually sons-in-law. And so they don't get good intelligence, and so they become detached from reality. So when I saw him sitting there at those tables, even with the Kremlin Security Council, that was a very bad sign.
Mentioned Navalny, and I just want to ask, there's obviously opposition to Putin inside Russia. We've seen protests in the last week, people taking to the streets courageously at the risk of arrest and potentially worse. Obviously, in terms of the reports from the front, we've seen evidence that he has not been upfront with the very young men who are in uniform, who are being asked to carry this out, that many of them said they didn't expect to actually have to invade Ukraine. They're not sure what they're doing there. Obviously, the oligarchs now must be upset given the blowback from the West and the severe sanctions. And so I guess if you add all of this up, the paranoia, does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Is Vladimir Putin today, as a result of taking this action about a week ago, is he more vulnerable? And do you think that at some point we may be looking at the end of Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia?
I think he's much more vulnerable, and it's a symptom that the military machine is a fearsome, huge military machine, and it's logical that he's falling back on, he's going to double down, which is just horrible for Ukraine because that's all he has at this point. But you see this, the cracks in the facade that a couple of oligarchs have spoken out against him. Prominent Russians have resigned from jobs. And in a true authoritarian regime like his, these may seem like small things, but they have a lot of significance because they let others know that there's dissent even in places that people didn't think there was. Now, however, there's one thing to say he's more vulnerable and another to think about regime change, because all of those oligarchs and all kinds of other people are quite wedded to this system, the spoil system of kleptocracy. And so it can take a long time for things to get so dire that there's some kind of intervention. So we're not there yet, but he's following the patterns of many autocrats who have not ended well. Can say that.
Well, it's really interesting, and we're going to obviously continue to watch. Hard to make any conclusive determinations about what's in store for Russia or Vladimir Putin or the world, but Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. Fascinating discussion, and hope to chat more in the future. Well, another priority tonight, a big one for President Biden, is the future of the Supreme Court. Last week, President Biden nominated federal appellate judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be his nominee to the Supreme Court to replace Justice Stephen Breyer. And we'd now like to welcome Senator Alex Padilla, Democrat from California. Thank you very much, Senator, for joining us. I understand, first and foremost, that you tested positive for COVID today, and you'll be watching tonight's speech from home. Hope you're feeling okay.
I am feeling fine, completely normal, asymptomatic, thankfully. So yes, vaccines work, but it was quite a surprise when I got the result late last night. So I think a reminder for everybody to continue to follow the guidance. If you haven't been fully vaccinated, please make your appointment. Vaccines are free, available. If you haven't been boosted and you're eligible, make sure you get boosted. So just staying productive. I'll be, like everybody else, watching the State of the Union from the confines of the residents.
Yeah, well, we're sorry to hear about the positive result, but we're glad you could be with us live tonight in the run-up to the speech. I want to ask you, sit on the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, obviously, which is going to be running the confirmation hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson, President Biden's nominee. What are you hearing so far from Chairman Durbin and your other colleagues about how quickly this hearing may get scheduled and whether a few Republicans are likely to support her in the end?
Yeah, no, look, those are the million-dollar questions. Nothing definitive yet. Obviously, we are hoping for a fair and timely process. I don't think this needs to drag out for 6 months, but we want to make sure we're doing our job as a committee. In terms of whether Republicans will be supportive, God, I hope so. Because frankly, Judge Jackson's qualifications are impeccable. She is beyond qualified for this job. We know there's a couple of Republicans who have already made some noise about, President Biden's pledge to nominate the first Black woman to the Supreme Court, and he's living up to that commitment. I applaud it and am appreciative to play a part in this process. But to use her education as a liability, for example, I just hope that is not a sign of things to come. She deserves better in the confirmation process. And ultimately, the significance of this appointment is huge. As you know, I am the first Latino to represent California in the United States Senate. From my first year experience, I can assure you representation matters. And the voice of a Black woman on the Supreme Court has been lacking throughout our nation's history. Her presence there, her engagement there will absolutely matter and make a difference.
So a message for all those Democrats who might sit here and say, well, it's still going to be a 6-3 court. This doesn't really matter. You would say otherwise, clearly.
I would say otherwise. I think in previous interviews, people have asked, well, what's the significance of that voice, given the numbers, as you said, a 6-3 split to a conservative majority. So I'm going to be in my conversations with Judge Jackson, encouraging her to use that voice. We know that Supreme Court justices, as federal judges up and down the judiciary, have taken different approaches and can at times be more persuasive with their colleagues. And I do believe that Judge Jackson is certainly capable of that. And God knows we need to look at the issues that rise to the level of the Supreme Court. Some of the most consequential issues, some of the most consequential challenges for our nation.
Yeah, and just to you at home, you're seeing there on the side of your screen a live look at the House chamber, lawmakers starting to gather. We're at the bottom of the hour, so still about 40 minutes or so until the president is set to begin his speech. No surprise, he is going to talk later on tonight about rising costs for Americans, whether it's for groceries, whether it's for gas, all kinds of goods and products. I'm sure that you've heard from constituents about how things are getting more expensive. I'd be interested in what you think the president can and should say to those people who are frustrated that their paycheck just isn't going as far as it used to.
Yeah. Look, I'm not only hearing it from constituents, I'm hearing it from within my own home and from many friend and family member. Filling up the car with gas isn't as easy as it was just a couple of months ago. So I get it. I get it. And I think the president will have a message and a plan. Part of whatever the Build Back Better agenda will morph into, and I am optimistic we will make progress on so many of those elements, was to do exactly this, address affordability and what it's like for families to make ends meet at the end of the month. Our investments in housing, affordable housing, while we address homelessness, is key because, the biggest bill you pay at the end of the month is either the rent or the mortgage for most people. The cost of prescription drugs, something that we had a paid-for plan to tackle in Build Back Better, is another significant piece. And as a father of 3, my wife and I are constantly thinking about childcare. Where do we have a safe place to leave our kids when they're not in school? Childcare tax credits, childcare child tax credits, child care subsidies, and investing in that sector is a key part of putting families in a position to prosper in the months and years ahead. So I think we're going to hear a president who's compassionate, recognize the dynamic, and then offer bold ideas and solutions to address it.
Senator Alex Padilla, watching from home tonight because of a positive COVID test, but thankfully with mild symptoms. Really appreciate your time. Glad to be able to get you tonight. Rest up, and we'll talk to you again down the road. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are off to a running start. We're about a half hour away from things really getting going in earnest. What do you think when Democrats are talking about? I mean, they're obviously aware now of the pocketbook concerns of American folks, but do you think they have enough of a plan? Or I mean, are people not going to be satisfied really until inflation comes down and gas is cheaper? I
mean, I think what Senator Padilla just spoke about is the reason that Democrats are worried about the midterm elections, because people are feeling it in their pocketbooks. And, and midterms are already hard for the party that's in power in the White House. Democratic voters, such as young people, minorities, are less likely to turn out. And then you have this, so they were already sort of had all these issues historic trends that they were dealing with. But with this added inflation, and with, as the senator said, people feeling it in his own household, if this is still going on in November, I do think that it's going to be a problem for the party.
Democrats have a plan. It's just being obstructed by their own party, by Sistema and Manchin. And they try to pass something through the Senate, and it's not happening. So as long as you have those roadblocks, no matter what the Democrats might want to push in Washington, it's not going to happen. The voters aren't going to understand that. So come November, if things do not improve, the voters are going to have their revenge against the Democratic Party.
Right. Whether it's the progressives you blame or whether you blame Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, nothing getting done is nothing getting done.
Yeah.
And that's what most people who are not tuned to this stuff every day are going to take away. Do you think it's critical? I mean, the Build Back Better legislation, included funding for climate, as we talked about, a lot of subsidies and tax breaks for working families. You don't get the sense, looking at polling, that is the thing that people want most of all. It seems like there are concerns about kids in schools and COVID, and there are concerns about the cost of gasoline and groceries. But it also seems like there's more to be done that they need to do. But also a question of, if you talk about that a lot tonight, you're raising expectations again. Right. And you already have a lot on your plate.
It's a very American thing. We only care about what's immediately in front of us. And that's totally understandable, because if you are paying so much more for gas now and you can't buy as many groceries, of course, but you also have to think years ahead, decades ahead. And the problem with Biden and the Democrats right now is that they're only thinking about in the future, as they rightfully should, but they're not paying attention to what's going on in the present and what the voters are asking them right now, like the issue with schools and COVID and masks. That's a huge issue. The Democrats ignored it for far too long. And maybe now, yes, the masks are coming down, but it might be too much, too little, too late.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the sort of short-term focus and long-term focus. The Biden folks, in addressing climate change, for example, they have really thought about the bigger picture, but they maybe have taken their eye off the ball when it comes to the short-term political situation.
It sort of illustrates the fight in the Democratic Party. I mean, they all might agree on a certain set of issues, whether it's climate change or reproductive rights, et cetera, but which issues are they prioritizing? And that's, you have the progressive wing who wants to talk about stuff like climate change. And then you have, some more middle of the road Democrats who are arguing that, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or whatever the cliche is, that the need to focus on things that are impacting people's lives right now.
Right. Well, and, it's not just Democrats who are going to be eager to hear what the president says. Republicans will be watching closely tonight. Congressional Republicans in something of an interesting position, staking out where they are on Ukraine and on energy prices in particular, without perhaps appearing too critical at this moment. I don't know if it's a moment, but it could be, moment of unity across the West, at least when it comes to Ukraine. Here's Representative Doug LaMalfa of California's 1st District, bordering Oregon and Nevada. Congressman LaMalfa, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. Just want to start with what you're looking for to hear from the president tonight.
I hope President Biden will break out of this climate change only conversation and look at what is really needed for that strategic issue with energy for our foreign partners, as well as what we need at home to get prices back down. We can flood the market with these forms of energy and bring the prices back down to something we've been more used to, instead of $5 for gas in California and who knows what for the natural gas.
Do you think the administration should go further in sanctioning Russia's energy industry, potentially banning exports of oil and gas or imports from Russia into the United States? Or do you think that given how precarious the markets are already, that they're striking the right balance?
I'll commend the president for stepping up and doing what has been done on sanctions so far, but I think we can do both at the same time. At the same time that the president would do an executive order to turn back on oil exploration and gas exploration and full production and pipeline, all the infrastructure we need to move that product. At the same time, we should be sanctioning and just stopping the usage of Russian energy and encouraging our foreign partners to do that as well.
Also earlier today, I spoke with Representative Jay Obernolte of California's 8th District, also bordering Nevada. I began by asking the congressman what he and other Republicans are hoping to hear from President Biden tonight.
Well, I really hope that he addresses something that is really front of mind for many of the people that I represent, and that is the disastrous impacts that inflation has had on their ability to pay their bills and meet the expenses of their families. As you know, we're suffering the worst inflation in over 40 years. It's really having an impact on the people that I represent, and many economists agree that this round of inflation has been catalyzed by deficit federal government spending that's occurred over the last 2 years.
Congressman, one more question before I get you out of here in our last 30 seconds. What grade would you give the Biden administration so far in its overall response to the situation in Russia and Ukraine?
How about a solid B? It's first of all, I think that even people on the other side of the aisle would acknowledge that the administration's disastrous handling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan played a substantial role in emboldening Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. However, I think the president's done a pretty good job of rallying international support. This kind of international unity is something that the world has not seen in quite a long time. And now we've got countries like Finland who are talking about joining NATO. And I think that the administration had a part in leading that. I think the vast majority of us in Congress are firmly behind his resolve to impose economic sanctions on Russia. As I said, there are some of us, like myself, that wish he would go a little further. And there are some other actions that we wish he would take. For example, I wish that he would join countries like Canada and the EU in closing U.S. airspace to Russian aircraft. I think that would add to the sanctions that we've already proposed. But I think there's some good give and take there, but I'll give them a B.
A B.
Wow.
Not bad.
Oh my Lord, I'm very surprised. Yeah, Republicans giving Joe Biden something higher than a D.
I mean, it's kind of remarkable. Maybe this is that one issue, but it's also fascinating because when you look at this from a political lens in terms of American politics, the Russia and the Putin story, it's a little different now for Republicans, right? We had 4 years of a president who embraced Vladimir Putin, tried to extort Ukraine's president, and now it seems like the politics of sort of good and evil, now that Vladimir Putin has invaded a democratic country, neighboring country, are just so clear to a lot of people that I think a lot fewer Republicans can stand there and make excuses for the former president.
This seems like Republicans are returning to the norm. I mean, if you think about under Reagan, under George W. Bush, the relationship, Reagan standing up, the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War. This is
empire.
Yeah, I mean, this is like sort of returning to the idea that Russia and people like Putin are not our friends. You
know what it makes me think of? It's the OG Republican orthodoxy. But it makes me think of, and I'm just mentioning this to you because you were on this trip with me, Jeb Bush in Europe 2015 before announcing when he was supposedly the front runner. I think about this all the time. I'm just taking a moment of personal privilege to talk about it because you were there. But do you ever think about that?
I posted the picture of us in front of
we went to time warp that was when the Republican orthodoxy was to be a Putin hawk. He went to Estonia and Poland and saw Merkel and said, "I'm going to be tough on Putin." And then the primary field went with Donald Trump.
I think about that.
Now
I recently posted the
back.
picture of us at the NATO facility in Estonia and just how close we were to Russia and how much of a focus there was. And then I also think about 2012. Do you remember during the debate between Romney and Obama when Romney said Russia was the number one geopolitical problem? And people made fun of him. Obama made fun of him. He said the 90s were the 90s were the foreign policy back. And I mean, that's pretty impressive. Or 80s. Yeah, the 80s, yeah. So I do think about, this is the Republican Party returning to what we were used to seeing from them for a long time until the last 4 years.
It's been quite a journey.
It's what you mentioned earlier. We are in a moment. We're a moment where the Republicans realize, we kind of have to fall behind the president, and the president's not doing too bad. In fact, we're giving him a B because the threat that Russia poses to the world right now is such that we just need to drop our beef and get together, maybe just for a little bit until this passes through.
But I think what'll be interesting to watch tonight, because part of the State of the Union is about theater, and so the party in power, they'll all cheer for Biden, and Republicans will most of the time probably sit on their hands. And I wonder when he talks about Ukraine whether we do see that sort of unity, or if this is just one of
whether the full room stands up,
the full applause, standing
exactly.
low, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can overstate how the GOP Twitter account, they've still been hammering Biden on inflation. But I think individually, when lawmakers get asked specifically about Ukraine, as we just heard, the temptation is not to throw punches and to give credit where credit is due in terms of unifying the transatlantic coalition.
And you see this for the statements that the leadership has put out, the leadership of the Republican Party, where they've made a point of criticizing Putin but not criticizing Biden in this one narrow area.
Right.
And let's see really quickly if Biden can carry that whatever goodwill he has towards the rest of his domestic agenda.
Yeah, I mean, he's been in the low 40s for a while, so if this can be a moment to get him up a few points, that'll be significant. Well, record high gas prices and soaring inflation, as we've talked about, have millions of Americans feeling pretty uncertain about what's going on with the economy broadly. Joining us now is LA Times reporter John Healy. John, thank you for spending some time with us tonight as we wait for the State of the Union. You've written about something Californians and really all Americans are concerned about, the rising price of gas. So I'll ask you, how much worse is that going to get?
Well, part of that depends on whether we get serious about sanctioning Russian energy exports. At this point, there's no indication that we will, but if we do, that's going to have a major effect on the global markets. So at the moment, I think you have to look at the most recent action, which is the United States and other global nations saying they're going to dip into their strategic reserves. And they're going to release something like 60 billion gallons or barrels of oil. Forgive me for not knowing that distinction. So there's going to be a lot more supply on the market. And that should actually make a difference in prices in the short term. How long the war in Ukraine lasts, nobody knows. And so we don't know whether they're going to have to keep dipping into the reserves or not.
Yeah, I think it's 60 million gallons globally, 30 million of which are coming from the U.S. Strategic Reserve. But you also have inflation to deal with. We're seeing that at levels we haven't seen in decades. And I wonder if you think there's anything that President Biden, his administration, can do to slow that down.
Well, inflation in this case is a mismatch of supply and demand on a really big scale because you have forces that are working on both sides. You have the demand side being inflated a bit by a lot of money in the economy, both in terms of the easy credit policies that we've been pursuing, particularly since COVID started, and the extra money that Congress and the administration have been pumping into the economy. So you've got extra demand. Meanwhile, you've got supply that's been constrained by all sorts of issues related to COVID. So you have the ongoing problems in the supply chain, which are getting better. I just looked at a report from the ports of LA and Long Beach, and their waiting period for boats is down significantly. The number of boats that are waiting to dock is down significantly. It's down about 40%. So there are signs that there could be some movement in the big macro picture. Now, what the president can do is not as direct as what the Fed can do. And the president doesn't control the Fed. We're going to see what they do in a couple of weeks when they start ratcheting up interest rates. But what the president can talk about, he can express his empathy for the public. And he can also talk about ways to try to lower costs in an attempt to make paying your bills less painful every month.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks will be listening tonight, hoping for something on that subject. John Healy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And now, in just a few minutes, of course, the president will be entering the House chambers. And here with a final analysis before the president's address is Professor Lori Cox Hahn, a political scientist and professor at Chapman University. Professor Hahn, welcome. Thank you for being with us. You've said that you don't envy President Biden's speechwriter tonight. Why is that?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I'll just say that this is probably one of the most challenging State of the Unions for any president we've seen in quite some time. When you look at everything going on the world stage, plus everything going on here in this country, he has many, many topics he needs to address tonight. And I think that the entire world will be watching, given what's going on in Ukraine, to see what our commander-in-chief has to say about that. So it's just challenge after challenge. So that's a lot of ground to cover in what is usually a 60, 70-minute speech.
These speeches are always unwieldy because it's the president's one chance to speak to this huge audience watching, and of course the lawmakers. But they're going to try to touch on everything that they can to appease this constituency and all of them. But I feel like the Ukraine war is obviously complicated because you have to talk about it. You have to make it a feature of the speech. It may overshadow the other things you say. But do you think it's also an opportunity for this president to frame, to put this in a frame that makes it bigger, more meaningful to people, and maybe less partisan? Because instead of a partisan policy agenda, you have the commander-in-chief sort of leading a global coalition.
Right. I mean, generally, presidents want to reach out in a bipartisan way to both sides of the aisle for the policy agenda that he's trying to lay out. But tonight, with this situation, especially with breaking news, probably, throughout the State of the Union, then he's got to be much more current and up to date in terms of, real time to be able to address these issues. And I really do believe that there, people around the globe are going to be listening tonight in a way that maybe we haven't seen before with this type of address, maybe since 20 years ago when George W. Bush was giving his first State of the Union months after 9/11.
Yeah, and you're seeing the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, entering the gallery there as we get closer to the State of the Union address. I want to talk to you about Biden specifically as a politician. This is a guy who overcame a stutter as a child. He's now president of the United States. He has, he ran twice before, didn't get there. He's often been underestimated. As a politician, perhaps some of that is because he does not, deliver these stirring speeches. He's not known for rousing oratory like Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan. And in this format, this is a speech. And so I wonder how, a guy who talks in kind of an everyman vernacular, can that break through? Or is this format maybe more challenging for Joe Biden than another president?
I actually think this is a good format for Joe Biden, because when he's scripted and, reading off the teleprompter, it gives him an opportunity in this very historic setting for this annual address to sound presidential. And, when he's off script, he can sometimes be, as I always say, a walking gaffe machine. Now, some people, like that about him, find that endearing about him. But at this point in his career, I think that this may be the biggest speech ever. I mean, certainly it's up there with the inaugural address a little over a year ago, but this is a really important speech for him. So I think he will probably do better with the speech in front of him on the teleprompter and not too many opportunities to go off script.
Well, we'll see. There are always opportunities to go off script. It's just a matter of whether you take them. Professor Hahn, thank you so much for joining us. I know we'll hear from you a little bit later tonight after the speech, so we'll look forward to talking in just a bit. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
It's interesting, Biden, the ad libber, he's not known for giving a great speech, but I think to her point, this is the most important speech he will give as president so far, because, the inaugural address, the table's set, everybody's kind of predisposed to be like, the new president, everyone's going to give you a shot. Now we're a year into this, right? He hasn't gotten the pandemic to go away. Not that a president could do that, but people are frustrated with that. There's other frustrations we've talked about. His numbers are where they are. And so this is, I think, obviously more critical because this is a chance to try to change the trajectory of a presidency and his party's trajectory if they're going to have any hope of holding on to Congress next year.
Well, it's also tricky because he can't overpromise. And then, if he overpromises and doesn't deliver, that's not good for the midterms. So it's going to be really, but as the professor said, though, him being on a teleprompter, it's not going to be off the cuff. That's helpful. And even though he is not an Obama-esque speaker, he does resonate with because of his upbringing, because of some of the challenges he's faced in his life. He does resonate with voters, with some voters. If I could just point to one piece of imagery that I find really interesting right now, there's going to be two women behind him. They're both Californians. Right. Speaker Pelosi has obviously been there before. this is the first time Vice President Harris is attending a State of the Union. So just, as California presidents, I think it's, notable that, the two people, among the most powerful people in the world are both women there, and both California women.
Historic, and I don't think Pelosi's going to steal the show by tearing up the prepared speech.
It would be pretty amazing if she did.
Maybe this time she does a high five to Biden and Harris.
It is interesting though, and I think that there's a lot of there is a historic nature to this. Even though I think now we're kind of used to it, and there's been a lot written about Kamala Harris, and I don't know, she's not doing this right, or she's doing right. The coverage has been kind of negative. I think if you step back, just seeing her in that position, right, when a huge audience, millions of people are tuned in, that'll be meaningful.
Right, and I think to be fair, like vice presidents often don't love their coverage because they're not the number one. They sometimes get the more difficult jobs. So she has had kind of a bit of a bruising year. Her staff has certainly pushed back at it, but you're reminded at moments like this that her run and their victory was historic.
Going back to the nomination of a Black woman for Supreme Court Justice, representation matters. Even if it's just standing there, you don't have to agree with her politics, but representation matters.
You talk about overpromising a minute ago, and I wonder if you think, we've talked about this a little bit in the last hour. Did Biden overpromise, given that the majorities that the Democrats hold are so narrow? Do you think that in the first year that one of the mistakes was envisioning this FDR-style presidency, which is what the base wanted, obviously, but so far has not been achievable?
He had to overpromise. I mean, the country, after 4 years of Trump, wanted a savior, wanted someone who was going to bring us back to some sense of normalcy. So he had to overpromise. There was no way he was going to match those promises. It's completely unfair to him and what he's done to have that. Now, though, he has to deal, he overpromised too much, basically. Now he has to come back and try to normalize what he can do. And again, this is such a crucial, weird time for him to be giving the speech. I've always liked Joe Biden. People say, oh, he's a stumbler, whatever. No, he's Joe from Scranton. And people from Scranton, working class folks. You're not expecting them to be lofty orators. You expect them, though, to get the job done. Let's see if Biden can get the job done.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the working class, hard scrabble Scranton appeal that he has. Is a big part of why Obama picked him, in 2008, and a big part of why he was the Democratic Party's nominee in 2020. As we continue to watch in the bottom corner of your screen, the House chamber filling up. We just saw the Supreme Court. We're talking about the historic nomination. We just saw several of the justices coming in, led by Chief Justice Roberts. They're taking their seats. I think most members, you don't see, we're talking about the progress that we've seen on COVID. I think it's very important that we haven't talked about this yet, but you do not see a ton of masks
I've only seen
on the House
two.
floor.
Right.
And I think, right, they just changed the rules.
There's a mask.
Right, so there will be some.
So there's the First Lady, and she's walking in, she's not wearing a mask.
Right, and this is not unintentional, this is not an accident, right, that this happened just before the State of the Union, because this administration needs to show progress.
Exactly.
And it's better to show progress, I think, than to describe progress in the speech, right? You can say as much as you want, but if everybody's sitting there in masks, no one's going to believe that you're over
That's what I was just going to say.
Pandemic.
Right now they said you can wear masks if you want to, you're not required to. If a bunch of Democrats had sat there with masks on, that would have not been the optics that they would want. So absolutely.
On the other hand, Senator Padilla tested positive for COVID. So this pandemic is not over. It is not over, folks. It is not over.
Well, and just to go back to what he said, he was surprised, right? We're sort of at a low ebb in cases. So I think a lot of people, right, the mask guidance has been eased significantly. And I think there's some surprise. But, I think that as we continue to watch the House floor, and I'm not sure if we have the president coming in quite yet. If he is, he would be early, and that would be unique. I think this is the president's cabinet. Yep, that's Secretary of State Blinken coming in, Defense Secretary Austin. It would be shocking if Joe Biden were 5 minutes early for a State of the Union address. But there's Agriculture Secretary Vilsack. I think, I just think, this is clearly a historic moment.
And think of how many times he sat in that chamber watching. I mean, how many State of the Unions has he seen throughout his long, long career? So for him to finally, get this office and that he's wanted for so long, you have to wonder sort of what that's like from his perspective.
It is interesting to think about it that way, as a guy who ran for this office so many times, and at 78 won the presidency. He's 79 now. To have this opportunity.
He's not going to mess it up. He can't mess it up because everyone's expecting him to mess it up because they think, his approval numbers are just very, very low. So he's going to do whatever needs to be possible to at least have people feel a little bit better about where we're at right now.
And, hard to tell watching the live stream from the set here, but it sounded like some applause for Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Obviously, this is the guy who's been really leading the response on Ukraine and has been in these negotiations with the Russian foreign minister and I was in Munich a weekend ago and he was there with the vice president. And so if that's foreshadowing potentially of the reaction that Biden may get in the speech when he mentions Ukraine, it appeared that the Secretary of State just got a warm ovation as he entered the House chamber. And we are 1 minute before 9 p.m. in the East, 6 o'clock here in Los Angeles. It looks as though the president is about to enter. And to your point about the history, right, and just kind of, if you've watched State of the Unions, right, we're right up on that moment where the Sergeant at Arms calls out, Madam Speaker, in this case, the President of the United States. And that, it's one of these sort of traditional, a hallmark of our democracy, even if it's a ritual. Right. It's a memorable thing to see every year.
If you do not feel some tingle of patriotism in it, then you're not a real American.
Well, it's just, for people who, this isn't a campaign rally. This is, sort of the president, regardless of which party it is. Tonight, is the president, saying, here's what's going on with our nation. Here's what we're striving for. Here's what we're struggling with. And it's just, I just think it's hard not to feel like a little twinge.
Yeah, it's a moment of optimism one way or another. No matter who the president is, even if you don't like that person, it's like, okay, it all falls back to these traditions that we've had, to this democracy that we have, and the promise that is America. For all of its problems, America has always been on promise.
It may be a low bar now when you talk about the coarsening of our politics, given where we've been over the last decade. But I think back to, President Obama's State of the Union when the congressman from South Carolina yelled out, "You lie," from the balcony. I'd be surprised if we heard an outburst like that. It feels like, obviously I wouldn't say that like happy bipartisan days are here again by any stretch, even if they stand up and applaud on something about Ukraine. But I also think because Joe Biden is such a known commodity.
Right. Well, he has so many relationships with people in that
personal
room,
relationships
that he's had for decades. But also, you have to think every single person who came in that room, they had to go through. There's extra security around the Capitol right now, and it makes you think back to January 6th. So there are visible reminders of, some of the polarization that's affecting our country, and what happened a little over a year ago there.
You expect that he will mention? This is the first State of the Union. He gave a speech that was not the State of the Union. But do you think he'll mention that being in that chamber that was, or do you think he'll want to move on and maybe?
He's going to mention the polarization of where we're at. I don't know if he would do that because the American people, for better or for worse, want to move on. And again, that's not on their mind right now. What's on their mind is inflation, is gas, is Ukraine. And there's so many other things on their mind rather than something that's still very important, a low point in American democracy. But, and there's other things that you could talk about.
Yeah, I think, generally watching this administration and this president, they have supported, they have not blocked the January 6th commission, right? They have not, they have denied the former president's claims of executive privilege. They have allowed all of this information to flow to the committee, but it's not something you hear featured in their messaging every day. They say that's a matter for the committee.
It would be seen as partisan.
And it is also, it was more than a year ago, and as Gustavo just said, there are so many pressing foreign and domestic issues right now that, and he can only talk about so much.
Well, and I think in terms of where you're going to find a little more support to get that 42% number up into the upper 40s or 50%, it's not going to be from people who are still outraged about January 6th. Those people are in your corner.
Exactly.
They are there. They're part of that 42%. We are getting close as we continue to keep an eye on the House chamber, and you see all the lawmakers standing, and sign of the times, you see several of them with their cell phones held up, taking a picture. This is, you said, talk about getting a little tingle or feeling a little tinge of patriotism just watching and being part of this annual ritual. Certainly the lawmakers who are in the room, I think, feel that as well, even if they've been there for a long time.
There was a headline. I wasn't able to read the story, but I saw a headline that President Biden is going to be talking about social media during his speech. And it's interesting that most of these folks in the chambers ostensibly are going to upload their photos to their social media accounts, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or whatnot. So it'll be interesting to see at a time where a lot of people are pushing on social media giants to stop the spread of disinformation. It used to be with COVID. Now it's with Russia. It'll be interesting to see what he talks about with that.
Isn't it amazing how content creation via social media, how that happens, whether it's politicians doing that, whether that's soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine. I mean, some of the most impactful, hard-hitting pieces of, I guess, journalism, but just documentation of that conflict so far have come from people on the ground, have come from people in uniform, using their phones to document what is happening and press send, and the whole world sees it.
We're all Robert Kappas now.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, it's it's interesting. I've thought a little bit about how Zelensky and individual Ukraine soldiers, the Snake Island, the people of Snake Island who told the Russian warship memorably, I think all of these things have a virality to them. And, Putin is the one who's supposedly the master of propaganda and media, and he's doing it, 20 years behind, as there finally
he can't control the message.
President. Yep. There is President Biden making his way in, and we'll take a listen as he receives applause in the House chamber. As we cut to the speech, just a reminder, please do stay with us after the speech. We're going to be right back here. We'll have the Republican rebuttal from Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. We will have instant reactions and analysis from lawmakers and reporters. So enjoy the speech, and we'll see you soon.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, General. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Please. Thank you so much. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, our First Lady and Second Gentleman, members of Congress and the Cabinet, Justice of the Supreme Court, my fellow Americans. Last year, COVID-19 kept us apart. This year, we're finally together again. Tonight, we meet as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, but most importantly, as Americans, with the duty to one another, to America, to the American people, to the Constitution, and an unwavering resolve that freedom will always triumph over tyranny. Thank you. Six days ago, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. From President Zelensky to every Ukrainian, their fearlessness, their courage, their determination literally inspires the world. Groups of citizens blocking tanks with their bodies, everyone from students to retirees to teachers, turned soldiers defending their homeland. And in this struggle, President Zelensky said in his speech to the European Parliament, "Light will win over darkness." The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States is here tonight, sitting with the First Lady. Let each of us, if you're able to stand and send an unmistakable signal to the world of Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She's bright, she's strong, and she's resolved. Yes, we, the United States of America, stand with the Ukrainian people. Throughout our history, we've learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving, and the cost, the threats to America and America to the world keeps rising. That's why the NATO alliance was created, to secure peace and stability in Europe after World War II. The United States is a member, along with 29 other nations. It matters. American diplomacy matters. American resolve matters. Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond. He thought he could divide us at home, in this chamber, in this nation. He thought he could divide us in Europe as well. But Putin was wrong. We are ready. We are united, and that's what we did. We stayed united. We prepared extensively and carefully. We spent months building coalitions of other freedom-loving nations in Europe and the Americas, from America to the Asian and African continents, to confront Putin. Like many of you, I spent countless hours unifying our European allies. We shared with the world in advance what we knew Putin was planning and precisely how we would try to falsify and justify his aggression. We countered Russia's lies with the truth. And now that he's acted, the free world is holding him accountable, along with 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, even Switzerland, are inflicting pain on Russia and supporting the people of Ukraine. Putin is now isolated from the world more than he has ever been. Together, 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 along with our allies, we are right now enforcing powerful economic sanctions. We're cutting off Russia's largest banks from the international financial system, preventing Russia's central bank from defending the Russian ruble, making Putin's $630 billion war fund worthless. We're choking Russia's access. We're choking Russia's access to technology that will sap its economic strength and weaken its military for years to come. Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who built billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. The United States, I mean it. The United States Department of Justice is assembling a dedicated task force to go after the crimes of the Russian oligarchs. We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We're coming for your ill-begotten gains. And tonight, I'm announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia and adding additional squeeze on their economy. He has no idea what's coming. The ruble has already lost 30% of its value. The Russian stock market has lost 40% of its value, and trading remains suspended. The Russian economy is reeling, and Putin alone is the one to blame. Together with our allies, we're providing support to the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom. Military assistance, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance. We're giving more than $1 billion of direct assistance to Ukraine, and will continue to aid the Ukrainian people as they defend their country and help ease their suffering. But let me be clear, our forces are not engaged and will not engage in the conflict with Russian forces in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies in the event that Putin decides to keep moving west. For that purpose, we have mobilized American ground forces, air squadrons, ship deployments to protect NATO countries, including Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And as I've made crystal clear, the United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch. And we're clear-eyed. The Ukrainians are fighting back with pure courage. But the next few days, weeks, and months will be hard on them. Putin has unleashed violence and chaos. But while he may make gains on the battlefield, he'll pay a continuing high price over the long run. And a pound of Ukrainian people, the proud, proud people, pound for pound, ready to fight with every inch of energy they have. They've known 30 years of independence, have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. To all Americans, I'll be honest with you, as I always promised I would be. A Russian dictator invading a foreign country has cost around the world. And I'm taking robust action to make sure the pain of our sanctions is targeted at the Russian economy, and that we use every tool at our disposal to protect American businesses and consumers. Tonight, I can announce the United States has worked with 30 other countries to release 60 million barrels of oil from reserves around the world. America will lead that effort, releasing 30 million barrels of our own strategic petroleum reserve. And we stand ready to do more if necessary, united with our allies. These steps will help blunt gas prices here at home, but I know news about what's happening can seem alarming to all Americans. But I want you to know we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. When the history of this era is written, Putin's war in Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. While it shouldn't have taken something so terrible for people around the world to see what's at stake, now everyone sees it clearly. We see the unity among leaders of nations, a more unified Europe, a more unified West. We see unity among the people who are gathering in cities and large crowds around the world, even in Russia, to demonstrate their support for the people of Ukraine. In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security. This is the real test, and it's going to take time. So let us continue to draw inspiration from the iron will of the Ukrainian people. To our fellow Ukrainian Americans who forged the deep bond that connects our two nations, we stand with you. We stand with you. Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people. He'll never extinguish their love of freedom, and he will never weaken the resolve of the free world. We meet tonight in an America that has lived through two of the hardest years this nation has ever faced. The pandemic has been punishing, and so many families are living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to keep up with the rising cost of food, gas, housing, and so much more. I understand, like many of you did. My dad had to leave his home in Scranton, Pennsylvania to find work. So like many of you, I grew up in a family when the price of food went up, it was felt throughout the family. It had an impact. That's when one of the first things I did as president was fight to pass the American Rescue Plan. Because people were hurting, we needed to act, and we did. Few pieces of legislation have done more at a critical moment in our history to lift us out of a crisis. It fueled our efforts to vaccinate the nation and combat COVID-19, delivered immediate economic relief to tens of millions of Americans. It helped put food on the table. Remember those long lines of cars waiting for hours just to get a box of food put in their trunk. It cut the cost of health care insurance. And as my dad used to say, it gave the people just a little bit of breathing room. Unlike the $2 trillion tax cut passed in the previous administration that benefited the top 1% of Americans, the American Rescue Plan helped working people and left no one behind. Folks, and it worked. It worked. It worked. We created jobs, lots of jobs. In fact, our economy created over 6.5 million new jobs just last year. More jobs in 1 year than ever before in the history of the United States of America. The economy grew at a rate of 5.7 last year, the strongest growth rate in 40 years. And the first step in bringing fundamental change to our economy that hasn't worked for working people in this nation for too long. For the past 40 years, we were told that tax break for those at the top and benefits would trickle down and everyone would benefit. But that trickle-down theory led to a weaker economic growth, lower wages, bigger deficits, and a widening gap between the top and everyone else in nearly a century. Look, Vice President Harris and I ran for office, and I realize we have fundamental disagreements on this, but ran for office with a new economic vision for America. Invest in America, educate Americans, grow the workforce, build the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, not from the top down, because we know when the middle class grows, When the middle class grows, the poor have a way up and the wealthy do very well. America used to have the best roads, bridges, and airports on earth. And now our infrastructure is ranked 13th in the world. We won't be able to compete for the jobs of the 21st century if we don't fix it. That's why it was so important to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I thank my Republican friends who joined to invest and rebuild America, the single biggest investment in history. It was a bipartisan effort, and I want to thank the members of both parties who worked to make it happen. We're done talking about infrastructure weeks. We're now talking about an infrastructure decade. And look, it's going to transform America, to put us on a path to win the economic competition of the 21st century that we face with the rest of the world, particularly China. I've told Xi Jinping it's never been a good bet to bet against the American people. We'll create good jobs for millions of Americans, modernizing roads, airports, ports, waterways, all across America. And we'll do it to withstand the devastating effects of climate change and promote environmental justice. We'll build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. Begin to replace the poisonous lead pipes so every child, every American has clean water to drink at home and at school. We're going to provide affordable, high-speed internet for every American, rural, suburban, urban, and tribal communities. 4,000 projects have already been announced. Many of you have announced them in your districts. And tonight, I'm announcing that this year, we will start fixing over 65,000 miles of highway and 1,500 bridges in disrepair. And folks, when we use taxpayers' dollars to rebuild America, we're going to do it by buying America. Buy American products. Support American jobs. The federal government spends about $600 billion a year to keep this country safe and secure. There's been a law on the books for almost a century to make sure taxpayers' dollars support American jobs and businesses. Every administration, Democrat and Republican, says they'll do it, but we're actually doing it. We'll buy America to make sure everything from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the steel on highway guardrails is made in America from beginning to end. All of it. All of it. But folks, to compete for the jobs of the future, we also need a level playing field with China and other competitors. That's why it's so important to pass the Bipartisan Innovation Act sitting in Congress that will make record investments in emerging technologies and American manufacturing. We used to invest almost 2% of our GDP in research and development. We don't now. China is. Let me give you one example why it's so important to pass. If you travel 20 miles east of Columbus, Ohio, you'll find 1,000 empty acres of land. It won't look like much, but if you stop and look closely, you'll see a field of dreams, the ground on which America's future will be built. That's where Intel, the American company that helped build Silicon Valley, is going to build a $20 billion semiconductor megasite, up to 8 state-of-the-art factories in one place, 10,000 new jobs. And in those factories, the average job about $135,000 a year. Some of the most sophisticated manufacturing in the world to make computer chips the size of a fingertip that power the world in everyday lives, from smartphones, technology, the internet, technology that's yet to be invented. But that's just the beginning. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger, who is here tonight. I don't know where Pat is. Pat, there you go, Pat. Stand up. Pat came to see me, and he told me they're ready to increase their investment from $20 billion to $100 billion. That would be the biggest investment in manufacturing in American history. And all they're waiting for is for you to pass this bill. So let's not wait any longer. Send it to my desk, I'll sign it, and we'll really take off in a big way. And folks, Intel is not alone. There's something happening in America. Just look around and you'll see an amazing story. The rebirth of pride that comes from stamping products made in America. The revitalization of American manufacturing. Companies are choosing to build new factories here when just a few years ago they would have gone overseas. That's what's happening. Ford is investing $11 billion in electric vehicles, creating 11,000 jobs across the country. GM is making the largest investment in its history, $7 billion to build electric vehicles, creating 4,000 jobs in Michigan. All told, 369,000 new manufacturing jobs were created in America last year alone. Folks, powered by people I've met like JoJo Burgess from generations of union steelworkers in Pittsburgh, who's here with us tonight. Where are you, JoJo? There you go. Thanks, buddy. As Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown says, it's time to bury the label Rust Belt. It's time to see the what used to be called the Rust Belt become the home of a significant resurgence of manufacturing. And with all the bright spots in our economy, record job growth, higher wages, too many families are struggling to keep up with their bills. Inflation is robbing them of gains they thought otherwise they would be able to feel. I get it. That's why my top priority is getting prices under control. Look, our economy roared back faster than almost anyone predicted. But the pandemic meant that businesses had a hard time hiring enough people because of the pandemic to keep up production in their factories. So you didn't have people making those beams that went into buildings because they were out. The factory was closed. The panic also disrupted the global supply chain. Factories close. When that happens, it takes longer to make goods and get them to the warehouses, to the stores, and prices go up. Look at cars last year. 1/3 of all the inflation was because of automobile sales. There weren't enough semiconductors to make all the cars that people wanted to buy. And guess what? Prices of automobiles went way up, especially used vehicles as well. And so we have a choice. One way to fight inflation is to drive down wages and make Americans poorer. I think I have a better idea to fight inflation. Lower your costs, not your wages. And folks, that means make more cars and semiconductors in America, more infrastructure and innovation in America, more goods moving faster and cheaper in America, more jobs where you can earn a good living in America. Instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. Look, economists call this increasing the productive capacity of our economy. I call it building a better America. My plan to fight inflation will lower your costs and lower the deficit. 17 Nobel laureates in economics said my plan will ease long-term inflationary pressures. Top business leaders, and I believe most Americans, support the plan. And here's the plan. First, cut the cost of prescription drugs. We pay more for the same drug produced by the same company in America than any other country in the world. Just look at insulin. 1 in 10 Americans has diabetes. In Virginia, I met a 13-year-old boy, the handsome young man standing up there, Joshua Davis. He and his dad both have type 1 diabetes, which means they need insulin every single day. Insulin costs about $10 a vial to make. That's what it costs the pharmaceutical company. But drug companies charge families like Joshua and his dad up to 30 times that amount. I spoke with Joshua's mom. Imagine what it's like to look at your child who needs insulin to stay healthy and have no idea how in God's name you're going to be able to pay for it. What it does to your family, but what it does to your dignity, your ability to look your child in the eye, to be the parent you expect yourself to be. I really mean to think about that. That's what I think about. You know, yesterday, Joshua's here tonight, but yesterday was his birthday. Happy birthday, buddy, by the way. For Joshua and 200,000 other young people with type 1 diabetes, let's cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month so everyone can afford it. And drug companies will do very, very well, their profit margin. While we're at it, I know we have great disagreements on this floor with this. Let's let Medicare negotiate the price of prescription drugs. They already set the price for VA drugs. Look, the American Rescue Plan is helping millions of families with Affordable Care Act plans to save them $2,400 a year on their health premiums. Let's close the coverage gap and make these savings permanent. And second, let's cut energy costs for families, an average of $500 a year by combating climate change. Let's provide an investment tax credits to weatherize your home and your business, to be energy efficient and get a tax credit for it. Double America's clean energy production in solar, wind, and so much more. Lower the price of electric vehicles, saving another $80 a month that you're not going to have to pay at the pump. Folks, the third thing we can do to change the standard of living for hardworking folks is cut the cost of child care. Cut the cost of child care. Folks, if you live in a major city in America, you pay up to $14,000 a year for child care per child. I was a single dad for 5 years, raising 2 kids. I had a lot of help, though. I had a mom, a dad, a brother, and a sister that really helped. But middle class and working folks shouldn't have to pay more than 7% of their income to care for the young children. My plan would cut the cost of child care in half for most families and help parents, including millions of women who left the workforce during the pandemic because they couldn't afford child care, to be able to get back to work, generating economic growth. But my plan doesn't stop there. It also includes home and long-term care, more affordable housing, pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds. All these will lower costs to families. And under my plan, nobody, let me say this again, nobody earning less than $400,000 a year will pay an additional penny in new taxes. Not a single penny. I may be wrong, but my guess is if we took a secret ballot in this floor, that we'd all agree that the present tax system ain't fair. We have to fix it. I'm not looking to punish anybody. But let's make corporations and wealthy Americans start paying their fair share. Look, last year, and like Chris Coons and Tom Carper and my distinguished Congresswoman, we come from the land of corporate America. There are more corporations incorporated in America than every other state in America combined. And I still won 36 years in a row. The point is, even they understand they should pay just a fair share. Last year, 55 of the Fortune 500 companies earned $40 billion in profit and paid zero in federal taxes. Now look, it's not fair. That's why I proposed a 15% minimum tax rate for corporations. And that's why in the G7 and other meetings overseas, we were able to put together, I was able to be somewhat helpful, 130 countries agree on a global minimum tax rate. So companies can't get out of paying their taxes at home by shipping jobs and factories overseas. It'll raise billions of dollars. That's why I propose closing loopholes for the very wealthy who pay a lower tax rate than a teacher and a firefighter. So that's my plan, but we'll go in more detail later. We will grow the economy, lower the cost of families. So what are we waiting for? Let's get this done. We all know we've got to make changes. Folks, and while you're at it, confirm my nominees for the Federal Reserve, which plays a critical role in fighting inflation. My plan will not only lower costs and give families a fair shot, it will lower the deficit. The previous administration not only ballooned the deficit with those tax cuts for the very wealthy and corporations, it undermined the watchdogs, the job of those to keep pandemic relief funds being wasted. Remember we had those debates about whether or not those watchdogs should be able to see every day how much money was being spent, where was it going to the right place? But in my administration, the watchdogs are back. And we're going to go after the criminals who stole billions of relief money meant for small business and millions of Americans. And tonight, I'm announcing that the Justice Department will soon name a chief prosecutor for pandemic fraud. And look, I think we all agree, thank you. By the end of this year, the deficit will be down to less than half of what it was before I took office. The only president ever to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a single year. Lowering your cost also meant demanding more competition. I'm a capitalist, but capitalism without competition is not capitalism. Capitalism without competition is exploitation. It drives up profits. And corporations have to compete. Their profits go up and your prices go up when they don't have to compete. Small businesses and family farmers and ranchers, I need not tell some of our overcharging American businesses and consumers. And folks, and as Wall Street firms take over more nursing homes, quality in those homes has gone down and costs have gone up. That ends on my fair shot, provide more training and apprenticeships, hire them based on skills, not just their degrees. Let's pass the Paycheck Fairness Act and paid leave. Raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and extend the child tax credit so no one has to raise a family in poverty. Let's increase Pell Grants, increase our historic support for HBCUs, and invest in what Jill, our First Lady who teaches full-time, calls America's best-kept secret, community colleges. Look, let's pass the PRO Act. When a majority of workers want to form a union, they shouldn't be able to be stopped. When we invest in our workers and we build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, together we can do something we haven't done in a long time, build a better America. For more than 2 years, COVID has impacted every decision in our lives and the life of this nation. And I know you're tired, frustrated, and exhausted. That doesn't even count the close to 1 million people who sit at a dining room table or a kitchen table and look at an empty chair because they lost somebody. But I also know this, because of the progress we've made, because of your resilience and the tools that we have been provided by this Congress, tonight I can say we're moving forward safely back to more normal routines. We've reached a new moment in the fight against COVID-19, where severe cases are down to a level not seen since July of last year. Just a few days ago, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention issued a new mask guidelines. Under the new guidelines, most Americans and most of the country can now go mask-free. And based on projections, more of the country will reach a point across the next couple of weeks. And thanks to the progress we've made in the past year, COVID-19 no longer need control our lives. I know some are talking about living with COVID-19, but tonight I say that we never will just accept living with COVID-19. We'll continue to combat the virus as we do other diseases. And because this virus mutates and spreads, we have to stay on guard. And here are 4 common sense steps as we move forward safely, in my view. First, stay protected with vaccines and treatments. We know how incredibly effective vaccines are. If you're vaccinated and boosted, you have the highest degree of protection. We'll never give up on vaccinating more Americans. Now, I know parents with kids under 5 are eager to see their vaccines authorized for their children. Scientists are working hard to get that done. We'll be ready with plenty of vaccines if and when they do. We're all ready. We are also ready with antiviral treatments. If you get COVID-19, the Pfizer pill reduces your chances of ending up in the hospital by 90%. I've ordered more pills than anyone in the world has. Pfizer is working overtime to get us 1 million pills this month and more than double that next month. And now we're launching the Test to Treat initiative. So people can get tested at a pharmacy, and if they prove positive, receive the antiviral pills on the spot at no cost. And folks, if you're immunocompromised or have some other vulnerability, we have treatments and free high-quality masks. We're leaving no one behind or ignoring anyone's needs as we move forward. On testing, we've made hundreds of millions of tests available, and you can order them for free to your doorstep. And we've already ordered free tests. If you already ordered free tests tonight, I'm announcing you can order another group of tests. Go to covidtest.gov starting next week, and you can get more tests. Second, we must prepare for new variants. Over the past, we've gotten much better at detecting new variants. If necessary, we'll be able to develop new vaccines within 100 days instead of maybe months or years. And if Congress provides the funds we need, we'll have new stockpiles of tests, masks, pills ready if needed. I can't promise a new variant won't come, but I can promise you we'll do everything within our power to be ready if it does. Third, we can end the shutdown of schools and businesses. We have the tools we need. It's time for America to get back to work and fill our great downtowns again with people. People working from home can feel safe and begin to return to their offices. We're doing that here in the federal government. The vast majority of federal workers will once again work in person. Our schools are open. Let's keep it that way. Our kids need to be in school. With 75% of adult Americans fully vaccinated and hospitalizations down by 77%, most Americans can remove their masks and stay in the classroom and move forward safely. We achieved this because we provided free vaccines, treatments, tests, and masks. Of course, continuing this costs money, so I'll not surprise you. I'll be back to see you all. And I'm going to soon send a request to Congress. The vast majority of Americans have used these tools and may want again. We may need them again, so I expect Congress, and I hope you'll pass that quickly. Fourth, we'll continue vaccinating the world. We've sent 475 million vaccine doses to 112 countries, more than any nation on earth. We won't stop because you can't build a wall high enough to keep out a vaccine. The vaccine can stop the spread of these diseases. You know, we've lost so much in COVID-19. Time with one another. The worst of all, much the loss of life. Let's use this moment to reset. So stop looking at COVID as a partisan dividing line. See it for what it is, a god-awful disease. Let's stop seeing each other as enemies and start seeing each other for who we are, fellow Americans. Look. We can't change how divided we've been. It was a long time in coming. But we can change how to move forward on COVID-19 and other issues that we must face together. I recently visited New York City Police Department days after the funerals of Officer Wilbur Mora and his partner, Officer Jason Rivera. They were responding to a 9/11 call when a man shot and killed them with a stolen gun. Officer Moore was 27 years old. Officer Rivera was 22 years old. Both Dominican Americans who grew up in the same streets that they later chose to patrol as police officers. I spoke with their families, and I told them that we were forever in debt for their sacrifices and will carry on their mission to restore the trust and safety of every community deserves. Like some of you that have been around for a while, I've worked with you on these issues for a long time. I know what works. Investigating crime prevention and community policing, cops who walk the beat, who know the neighborhood, and who can restore trust and safety. Let's not abandon our streets or choose between safety and equal justice. Let's come together and protect our communities, restore trust, and hold law enforcement accountable. That's why the Justice Department has required body cameras, banned chokeholds, and restricted no-knock warrants for its officers. That's why the American Rescue Plan that you all provided $350 billion that cities, states, and counties can use to hire more police, invest in more proven strategies. Proven strategies like community violence interruption, trusted messengers, breaking the cycle of violence and trauma, and giving young people some hope. We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police. It's to fund the police. Fund them. Fund them. Fund them with resources and training. Resources and training they need to protect our communities. I ask Democrats and Republicans alike to pass my budget and keep our neighborhoods safe. And will do everything in my power to crack down on gun trafficking of ghost guns that you can buy online, assemble at home, no serial numbers, can't be traced. I asked Congress to pass proven measures to reduce gun violence, pass universal background checks. Why should anyone on the terrorist list be able to purchase a weapon? Why? Why? And folks, ban assault weapons with high-capacity magazines that hold up to 100 rounds. You think the deer are wearing Kevlar vests? Look, repeal the liability shield that makes gun manufacturers the only industry in America that can't be sued. The only one. Imagine had we done that with the tobacco manufacturers. These laws don't infringe on the Second Amendment. They save lives. The most fundamental right in America is the right to vote and have it counted. And look, it's under assault. In state after state, new laws have been passed, not only to suppress the vote, we've been there before, but to subvert the entire election. We can't let this happen. Tonight I call on the Senate to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, pass the John Lewis Act, Voting Rights Act. And while you're at it, pass the Disclose Act so Americans know who's funding our elections. Look, tonight, I like to honor someone who dedicated his life to serve this country. Justice Breyer, an Army veteran, constitutional scholar, retiring Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Breyer, thank you for your service. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I mean it. Get up, stand, let them see you. Thank you. And we all know, no matter what your ideology, we all know one of the most serious constitutional responsibility a president has is nominating someone to serve on the United States Supreme Court. As I did 4 days ago, I've nominated the Circuit Court of Appeals, Ketanji Brown Jackson, one of our nation's top legal minds, who continue in Justice Breyer's legacy of excellence. A former top litigator in private practice, a former federal public defender, from a family of public school educators and police officers. She's a consensus builder. Since she's been nominated, she's received a broad range of support, including the Fraternal Order of Police and former judges supported by Democrats and Republicans. Folks, if we're to advance liberty and justice, we need to secure our border and fix the immigration system. And as you might guess, I think we can do both. At our border, we've installed new technology like cutting-edge scanners to better detect drug smuggling. We've set up joint patrols with Mexico and Guatemala to catch more human traffickers. We're putting in place dedicated immigration judges in a significant larger number so families fleeing persecution and violence can have their cases heard faster, and those who don't legitimately hear can be sent back. We're screening, we're securing commitments and supporting partners in South and Central America to host more refugees and secure their own borders. We can do all this while keeping lit the torch of liberty that has led a generation of immigrants to this land, my forebears and many of yours. Provide a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, those with temporary status, farm workers, essential workers. Revise our laws so businesses have workers they need and families don't wait decades to reunite. It's not only the right thing to do, it's economically smart thing to do. That's why the immigration reform is supported by everyone from labor unions to religious leaders to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Let's get it done once and for all. Folks, advancing liberty and justice also requires protecting the rights of women. The constitutional right affirmed by Roe v. Wade, standing precedent for half a century, is under attack as never before. If you want to go forward, not backwards, we must protect access to health care, preserve a woman's right to choose, and continue to advance maternal health care for all Americans. And folks, for our LGBTQ plus Americans, let's finally get the Bipartisan Equality Act to my desk. The onslaught of state laws targeting transgender Americans and their families, it's simply wrong. And I said last year, especially to our younger transgender Americans, I'll always have your back as your president so you can be yourself and reach your God-given potential. Folks, as I've just demonstrated, while it often appears we do not agree, and that we do agree on a lot more things than we acknowledge. I signed 80 bipartisan bills into law last year, from preventing government shutdowns, to protecting Asian Americans from still too common hate crimes, to reforming military justice, and will soon be strengthening the Violence Against Women Act that I first wrote 3 decades ago. And it's important. It's important for us to show the nation we can come together and do big things. So tonight I'm offering a unity agenda for the nation. 4 big things we can do together, in my view. First, beat the opioid epidemic. There's so much we can do. Increase funding for prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery. Get rid of outdated rules and stop doctors that stop doctors from prescribing treatments. Stop the flow of illicit drugs by working with state and local law enforcement to go after the traffickers. And if you're suffering from addiction, you should know you're not alone. I believe in recovery, and I celebrate the 23 million Americans in recovery. Second, let's take on mental health, especially among our children whose lives and education have been turned upside down. The American Rescue Plan gave schools money to hire teachers and help students make up for lost learning. I urge every parent to make sure your school does just that. They have the money. We can all play a part. Sign up to be a tutor or a mentor. Children were also struggling before the pandemic: bullying, violence, trauma, and the harms of social media. As Frances Haugen, who is here tonight with us, has shown, we must hold social media platforms accountable for the national experiment they're conducting on our children for profit. Folks, thank you. Thank you for the courage you showed. It's time to strengthen privacy protections, ban targeted advertising to children, demand tech companies stop collecting personal data on our children, and let's get all Americans the mental health services they need. More people can turn for help and full parity between physical and mental health care if we treat it that way in our insurance. Look, the third piece of that agenda is support our veterans. Veterans are the backbone and the spine of this country. They're the best of us. I've always believed that we have a sacred obligation to equip those we send to war and care for those in their family when they come home. My administration is providing assistance in job training, housing, and now helping lower-income veterans get VA care debt-free. And our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan have faced many dangers, one being stationed at bases breathing in toxic smoke from burn pits. Many of you have been there. I've been in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan over 40 times. These burn pits that incinerate waste, the waste of war, medical and hazardous material, jet fuel, and so much more. And they come home Many of the world's fittest and best trained warriors in the world, never the same. Headaches, numbness, dizziness. A cancer that would put them in a flag-draped coffin. I know. One of those soldiers was my son, Major Bo Biden. I don't know for sure if the burn pit that he lived near, that his hooch was near in Iraq and earlier than that in Kosovo, is the cause of his brain cancer, the disease of so many other troops. But I am committed to find out everything we can, committed to military families like Danielle Robinson from Ohio, the widow of Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson. He was born a soldier, Army National Guard, combat medic in Kosovo and Iraq, stationed near Baghdad, just yards from burn pits the size of football fields. Danielle is here with us tonight. They love going to Ohio State football games. And he loved building Legos with their daughter. But cancer from prolonged exposure to burn pits ravaged Heath's lungs and body. Danielle says Heath was a fighter to the very end. He didn't know how to stop fighting, and neither did she. Through her pain, she found purpose to demand that we do better. Tonight, Danielle, we are going to do better. The VA is pioneering new ways of linking toxic exposure to disease, already helping more veterans get benefits. And tonight, I'm announcing we're expanding eligibility to veterans suffering from 9 respiratory cancers. I'm also calling on Congress to pass a law to make sure veterans devastated by toxic exposure in Iraq and Afghanistan finally get the benefits and the comprehensive health care they deserve. And fourth and last, let's end cancer as we know it. This is personal. This is personal to me and to Jill and to Kamala and so many of you. So many of you have lost someone you love. Husband, wife, son, daughter, mom, dad. Cancer is the #2 cause of death in America, second only to heart disease. Last month, I announced the plan to supercharge the cancer moonshot that President Obama asked me to lead 6 years ago. Our goal is to cut cancer death rates by at least 50% over the next 25 years, and I think we can do better than that. Turn cancers from death sentences into treatable diseases. More support for patients and their families. To get there, I call on Congress to fund what I called ARPA-H, Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, patterned after DARPA and the Defense Department. Projects that led in DARPA to the internet, GPS, and so much more to make our forces more safer and be able to wage war with more clarity. ARPA will have a singular purpose: to drive breakthroughs in cancer, Alzheimer's and diabetes, and more. A unity agenda for the nation. We can do these things. It's within our power, and I don't see a partisan edge to any one of those 4 things. My fellow Americans, tonight, we've gathered in this sacred space, a citadel of democracy, in this Capitol. Generation after generation of Americans have debated great questions amid great strife and have done great things. We fought for freedom, expanded liberty, debated totalitarianism and terror. We built the strongest, freest, and most prosperous nation the world has ever known. Now is the hour. our moment of responsibility, our test of resolve and conscience, of history itself. It is in this moment that our character of this generation is formed. Our purpose is found. Our future is forged. Well, I know this nation. We'll meet the test, protect freedom and liberty, expand fairness and opportunity, and we will save democracy. As hard as those times have been, I'm more optimistic about America today than I've been my whole life, because I see the future that's within our grasp, because I know there's simply nothing beyond our capacity. We're the only nation on earth that has always turned every crisis we've faced into an opportunity. The only nation that can be defined by a single word: possibilities. So on this night, on our 245th year as a nation, I've come to report on the state of the nation, the State of the Union. And my report is this: the State of the Union is strong because you, the American people, are strong. We are stronger today. We are stronger today than we were a year ago. And we'll be stronger a year from now than we are today. This is our moment to meet and overcome the challenges of our time. And we will, as one people, one America, the United States of America. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you. Go get him.
And welcome back, everyone. That was State of the Union, President Biden's first. It ran exactly 1 hour, and he will be shaking hands on the floor of the House chamber for some time. We're going to get you all caught up with a lot of reaction response from Capitol Hill and from right here in our El Segundo studios. Here with me at the desk, Los Angeles Times political reporter Seema Mehta, and joining the conversation now, Times opinion columnist LZ Granderson. Thank you for coming in, for being part of this. Well, you guys watched it. Really covered pretty much everything. What do you think?
That it really did cover pretty much everything. I mean, I did sort of, when we were speaking before the speech, I really thought he would focus on 3 areas, and that which were Ukraine, the pandemic, and inflation. And he did focus on those 3 areas, but he also focused on about probably 20 other areas. So it really, there was a lot there to digest. And I thought some of the points that were interesting, they almost seemed designed to, when he's talking about funding the police, when he's talking about Made in America, when Democrats are chanting USA. I mean, it seemed like he was trying to put out a lot of things that could potentially appeal to both parties, but there was also a number of things in there, for example, talking about trans rights, reproductive rights, which were clearly designed to appeal to the base.
It's interesting because if you and me are in the studio tonight, we're not having to write the story for the paper tomorrow, but I don't know exactly what the headline would be. LZ, what do you think?
Well, you know what I said off camera, and I'll say it again: mediocre speech delivered by a mediocre public speaker. And I believe that if you were to lift perhaps the first 10 minutes of the speech, which addressed Ukraine and the conflict that's happening with Russia, and literally play the rest of the speech, that could have been said by anyone at any time. I mean, how many times have we heard a president talk about prescription drug prices and we need to bring them down? He has in his Build Back Better plan an attempt to allow Congress to negotiate the prices of drugs for Medicare. Go into detail. Explain to people what you're trying to do. Maybe you've tested it and decided that saying Build Back Better doesn't work. And so he kept referring to just my plan, my plan, my plan.
Notice that.
That's scattered messaging, right? Now people don't know what your plan is, and they don't know what Build Back Better is. You've got to find a better way of communicating both your successes, but also the challenges, and I just don't think he did that tonight.
Yeah, it was called, he said, Building a Better America. I call it Building a Better America, but I don't know if they're gonna go put that on, podiums and signs and T-shirts. It was interesting to me, another thing that you said off camera about whether or not it's clear that he is aware of why his numbers are where they are. This is a president who, I cover him every day, and there's been a lot written about the progressive bent of the West Wing and trying to get too much more than they actually could get out of Manchin and messing, not compromising sooner and trying, being afraid of upsetting the base. We've written about that. That's sort of a narrative that is out there and I think is real. But when you hear the president speak, and I think when you hear him in the speech tonight especially, you see a guy who still thinks that the place to make up ground, the place where he needs to be, the sweet spot politically, is the political middle. And you saw the Democrats' policy agenda, I think, kind of sandwiched into the middle of the speech, and there were these bookends that I think were clearly, he wanted to open with something unifying. He started with Ukraine. There were flags throughout the chamber of people with the Ukraine flag. Republicans stood and applauded, when he announced that the U.S. was going to impose a no-fly zone against Russian planes. And then at the end, this unity agenda, things that are rather benign politically. They're not going to get people too riled up on cable news, fighting opioids, veterans support, end cancer. But, it seemed like that was sort of where he was going, and where he wanted to start and end the speech was in the political middle, even though this has been a White House that, if their policy agenda hasn't advanced for any reason, it's probably because they've been catering too much to the left.
Well, if you look back at his campaign, this is what he said he could do. This is what he promised to voters, that he was the one person who could bring America back together again. We haven't necessarily seen that in terms of what's happened in Congress often, but this is what this is always what he's believed would be why he should be president. And so I think it's not surprising that he's making this sort of uniting play, but I don't think it also really reflects the reality of what's happening in D.C. right now.
I mean, not even right now. I mean, what's been happening fairly consistently, almost, I guess you could say, basically since the election of President Obama. There's been like this sort of almost nonsensical sort of divide along the partisan lines, because whatever the sitting president says or does, we're going to be against it. That seems to be the remnants of Newt Gingrich almost, that sort of keeps sort of popping up and interfering with what he needs to do in terms of getting his agenda pushed through. But I would argue, talking extensively about not defunding the police, talking extensively about adding more police officers onto the streets, while that may seem to make sense for a lot of people, I'm not quite sure if he workshopped that enough with his base.
Well, I think, you saw him go to New York City and appear with Eric Adams, the new mayor, and talk about an all of the above approach to crime. That wasn't really the speech. The speech did fall more heavily on the fund the police and less on there also needs to be police reform. I think we have that soundbite from the president. Let's maybe play that and then we can unpack it a little more. Oh, we don't have the sound. Well, you summarized it anyway. We don't need the sound.
We don't need a sound. And I want to be clear in terms of my criticism of this particular speech, and in some ways his approach to messaging what he's trying to accomplish. He has to remember what really got him elected. It wasn't him. Right? Can we be honest about that? It was a huge push by a lot of people who did not want to see President Trump back in office. And I think he needs to understand and recognize that and message and govern that way, that he has to still convince America he's the right guy, as opposed to convince America he's not that guy, which is what was the message, in my opinion, in November. I'm not that guy. But now he has to be, well, who are you? And if you keep mixing up your messages, if you keep believing that you can make Mitch McConnell your friend, come across the aisle and help push through your agenda, well, you're looking like the wrong person, because that's not the climate today. That's not what Americans see. That's not what's happening in D.C. I've done tons of reporting with grassroots leaders, particularly people of color. They're extremely frustrated with them, and I don't think this speech does anything to close that gap.
You think it's hard for him to talk about voting rights? I mean, his voting rights mention, it was such a passing mention. He didn't talk, right? This is the president who's met with George Floyd's family, who's called for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but it's not passing. It's not going anywhere. And I think, do you think that because those things are stalled, that makes it harder for him in a speech like this to talk about it, because you're either accepting defeat or you're raising people's expectations when nothing is going to happen?
But also, I don't think it's just him. If you look at Democratic mayors across the country, you mentioned New York City earlier, but we also have San Francisco, London Breed doing the same thing. Yeah. We have many of the people who are running for mayor in Los Angeles, including Representative Karen Bass, who's proposed increasing funding, for police, and these are all Democrats. So I think that there's Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I do think that there's a divide on this issue among Democrats, and then I mean, you did speak to his failure to get certain pieces of legislation passed, but I do think that we need to recognize that among the Democratic people politicians who are dealing with this on the ground, they don't all have one line of thought about it.
No, I totally agree with you, and you're right in terms of what's trying to happen locally and even statewide. But he's representing a national platform and agenda, right. And I think that's the disappointing part. If you look at the polling numbers, one of the reasons why his numbers are so low is because he's lost so many young people. But what was important to young people? Student loan debt forgiveness, criminal justice reform, voting rights protections, reproduction rights protections, climate, all these things that, to me, weren't properly addressed in today's speech.
Well, also, I mean, I think if you had told me that Representative Boebert would ever get up out of her seat clapping for a line from this speech, that not necessarily a line about foreign policy, but just basically scream in support, I wouldn't have believed you, and she did for the language on police funding.
We're watching the president still working the room, and that's no surprise. This is a president who likes to press the flesh, and he's been in that Capitol, the other end of the building, but he has been there for a lot of his career, so the relationships are strong and go back a long way, and he is, you see him there, having conversations on his way up the main aisle. As we continue to watch the president, I want to bring in a couple more guests and welcome back our political scientist, Professor Lori Cox-Hahn of Chapman University, and also here to tell us how social media is reacting to the host of the Los Angeles Times TikTok feed, Under the Desk News, V. Spehar. V, welcome. And tell us what played well tonight on social media and what didn't.
So the reaction from social media straight off, and I think you guys were sort of catching this too, is that Biden has a little bit of a grandpa energy, a little bit of like, I want to be your friend, let's be buddies. He didn't touch on the subjects that TikTok really cared about, which did focus around things like relieving student debt. TikTok has a really strong nurse and doctor following as well. They wanted to see things about paying nurses better, not capping nurses' pay, minimum staffing requirements. Overall, the take was that it was vague. It didn't really speak to the audience that TikTok oftentimes speaks to, but we did have great engagement. We had over 7,000 people join the feed, and we had, I think we're up to like 5.5 million likes for the commentary that we were providing throughout.
That's interesting. And, this is a president, he's 79 years old, but his White House has looked to these platforms like TikTok and put him on there with influential people on that platform. And I will see if they do more after the speech. There will be a media blitz kind of coming up in the next few days. Professor Hahn, be interested in your thoughts on how well the president communicated his core messages.
Well, I was a little disappointed, not surprised by the delivery. I mean, I could pick apart the style all night. I'll probably save most of that for my students later in the week. But in terms of the substance, I have to agree with some of your other guests. I think Biden missed an opportunity tonight to make this speech something more than just the typical laundry list that we hear year after year in the State of the Union. I mean, the first part of the speech, talking about Ukraine, obviously the announcement he made about, Russian flights, that was compelling. But the rest of it, like it's already been said, that I think he needed to acknowledge why his approval rating is so low. He needs to acknowledge the fact that Democrats are looking at a potential wipeout in November in the midterm elections. And I'm just really surprised that his communications team didn't read the room better before putting together this speech. I have to say, I've been paying attention to State of the Union addresses for many, many, many years. And I expected something different tonight. We got the same old thing that we usually see. And I agree that any president could have given most of that speech. And I think I just can't emphasize enough. I think President Biden just really missed an opportunity tonight.
But, you talk to voters and they say they're mainly concerned with, the cost of living, inflation, economics, and COVID and what it's doing, in terms of their kids' education and also just being able to go out and live a normal life. He addressed all those things. There were sections, new moment in the fight against COVID-19. Announced a new program where if you test positive, you can get the antiviral pill right there at the drugstore. On, inflation, there's a lot of stuff about lowering costs. I want to just ask you, when you say that he didn't quite speak to the reason, the things that voters care about or the things that, are going to acknowledge where he is and maybe help him climb a little bit higher. How would he have done it in a more effective way? Because, you know, on paper, like those things are in the speech. He read those lines off the teleprompter. What was missing in your view?
I think that he just tried to cover too much at a moment where the core issues really needed to be addressed. And when you get to that middle part of the speech where you literally start throwing everything in but the kitchen sink, that's when people tune out. I mean, there's a lot that he talked about that is really important to people, but he didn't give a lot of specifics. And I suspect that 15 to 20 minutes into the speech, which is what happens every year, a lot of people just said, you know, and just turn the channel. I mean, viewership for the State of the Union is down for many reasons over the last couple of decades. I don't think that this was something that really energized a lot of people from watching it. And, you know, I kept thinking of all the things he really wasn't talking about or just skipping over. You know, I mean, look, Biden's no Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, even a Bill Clinton in giving this kind of a speech. But I think that he could have been much more specific and compelling and given a speech that really resonated with people, especially young voters. The Democrats need young voters in a big way in November. And this speech tonight did not help with that.
V, before we let you guys go, speaking of young voters, you were sort of monitoring TikTok and social media for us. Was there any reactions that stood out to you that were memorable? Anything that there seemed to be a lot of the same reaction to anything?
I think that we're not seeing the energy that we saw from him on the campaign trail, and that definitely resonated. There are times when Biden is a really charismatic speaker, and it wasn't during this speech, and folks really noticed that. There were times when he was in debates where he would turn and look directly at the camera. I am reminded of the time when he was being called out and they were saying your son and his drug issues. And he said, yes, my son did have a drug problem, but he worked very hard to overcome that. And I'm very proud of him. When he looked in the camera and said that during debates, that really resonated and connected. And I think what we were missing tonight was that authenticity, was that off the book Biden that can make him look more like a maverick, make him look very cool, that he just didn't have that kind of energy tonight. And I think folks definitely picked up on that. And to your point, about 15, 20 minutes in after we were given a very vague update on Ukraine, we continued to see vague laundry list of all of the Democratic priorities. Mostly there was some notice of what they call on TikTok chuggy, which is stuff that is you shouldn't do because it's like an old way of doing something, or it's like maybe we would call it cringy. The slow clap from Schumer was definitely something folks noticed, the way that he kind of finished the speech by like cheering and clapping and Nancy clapping. A lot of that didn't play to the younger audience, and it came off as inauthentic. It came out of sort of out of touch. And I think he can be a really charismatic speaker when he's off book and more authentic. And I think folks would have liked to have seen that connection more this time.
Well, I think in Washington, cringe is sort of the sort of common denominator, frankly. But
yeah.
Well, listen, V, Spehar, Dr. Hahn, thank you so much for joining our conversation tonight. We're really glad to have you and really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Eli.
You know, I think one of the things they're talking about, both of them, is President Trump. When Biden was right there next to Trump on the stage, that's a foil, right? That's heightened drama. And I think also, you know, if President Biden, to your point, got elected because he wasn't Trump and we needed a break from that kind of insanity and the kind of nonstop news cycle and the melodrama, you know, I think what Dr. Hahn was saying is that this was boring. Right? And Donald Trump was not boring. So I don't know if this is also part of like, you know, we want what we don't have, and you know, and as soon as we get a guy who's in there and he's like, oh, thank God, you know, steady Eddie Biden, so boring. Then he gives us State of the Union. Everyone's like, this is kind of boring.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, no, go.
What surprised me was Joe Biden has been known for so long for his empathy. Right. And you certainly saw it on the campaign trail when he talks to a child who has a stutter, when he talks to a mother who's lost a child. I mean, he's just so well known for that. And that's what I think that the professor was just getting at, was that there wasn't that empathy. There wasn't that sort of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. Mm-hmm. Like he acknowledged sort of, like inflation's a problem, this is a problem, that's a problem. But there wasn't this, people are really like, suffering to, being able to buy their groceries, fill their gas tanks, et cetera. And that's what, it's kind of interesting because it's not, he's just so well known, he's so known for being empathetic that the idea that he was not in this setting, it was surprising to me.
He said it rhetorically at the end. The State of the Union is strong because of the American people. But it kind of came out of nowhere, right? And there wasn't a lot of buildup or talking about the stories and the, the sacrifices that American people have made in the last couple of years. There was maybe not as much of that as he could have put in there.
Well, again, you have to go back to what the communications team thought was the most effective speech. The speech writers, the back and forth, the drafts, et cetera. I'm assuming they workshopped it with members of their staff and things of that nature. The reality is that I don't think very many people who are in the top tier leadership of the Democratic Party truly understand the gap between their base and what the poll numbers are showing. And I'll give you an example. A couple Sundays ago, I was watching former Secretary Hillary Clinton. She was with Fareed Zakaria, and they were talking about President Biden's numbers. And she spent about 3, maybe 4 minutes or so going through a whole laundry list of reasons why she felt that his numbers were low. Missing from that was voting rights. Missing from that was student loan debt. Missing from that was criminal justice reform. Things that weren't missing on the campaign trail. Things that everyone understood was very important for young voters in particular, but people of color in general. And I think a large swath of society that saw the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 wanted to see some significant changes, and he was supposed to represent those changes. Now, I understand, we all understand, that politics in D.C. have always been problematic, and right now they're even more problematic than ever before because of the partisanship that's happening there. But Americans don't care about how the sausage is made. They're hungry. They just want to eat. And he's got to find a way between now and when he starts running for re-election, because as far as I'm concerned, based upon what we know has been the usual trend for a sitting president, the midterm is not going to be kind anyway.
Right.
So, but if he has any designs of being a two-term president, he's got to figure out how to communicate his plan, but more importantly, how to actually get those things that he sort of promised to voters who risked their lives in the height of a pandemic to vote for him, to actually get those things to fruition. He's got to find a way to get them across the finish line.
Yeah, and I think he talked a little bit about revamping the Build Back Better plan and trying to bring that back. When I talk to people in the White House, and this has been broadly reported, but there is a sense that the president at the end of the year after Build Back Better was derailed by Joe Manchin, that the course correction was, I'm not going to be a senator president anymore. I'm not going to be the one negotiating. People need me to go out there, be presidential, campaign for my policies and let the lawmakers work it out. And we'll keep working the phones and, twisting Joe Manchin's arm. We'll keep that more private because they feel like that had not worked well for him. The fact that you're just seen as negotiating and you're actually at the end of the day not getting anything done. But when you shy away from it and you step back, I don't know if they did a good enough job. I mean, as much coverage as Joe Manchin got, I don't know if they communicated well enough to the base and said, look, I know we said we want to do all these things, but we only have 50 votes in the Senate. You need 60, really. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to do this through reconciliation, you still need 50. And these two people over here, you can't count on them for a lot of what we want to do. And that comes through, I think, if you're really watching the news every day. But
excuse me, that's President Biden now. He's very upset.
He probably heard your comments, calling that guy. We need to talk. I think that it's hard because you need to explain to the base, if they're disappointed, they're disappointed, what the dynamic is. You've tried hard. You can't get there. You can't get Joe Manchin. And without Joe Manchin, you don't get all these judges. You don't get a Supreme Court. So, you may not be happy with him, but 50 votes is still 50 votes and it's better than 49. But it's hard to go out and talk about that, and it's hard for that to break through to most Americans who just don't have CNN on their TV all day.
Also, he has such a short window of time left to actually try to get anything done before the midterm. So if he can't, imagine what the State of the Union address is going to be like next year on these issues if nothing gets accomplished in the next couple months.
We're gonna take a break. We're just gonna hit pause on this conversation because we want to go to the official Republican response from Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds in Des Moines.
To the late 70s and early 80s, when runaway inflation was hammering families, a violent crime wave was crashing our cities, and the Soviet Army was trying to redraw the world map. Even before taking the oath of office, the president told us that he wanted to, quote, make America respected around the world again, and to unite us here at home. He's failed on both fronts. The disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal did more than cost American lives. It betrayed our allies and emboldened our enemies. North Korea is testing missiles again at an alarming rate. Speaker of the House recently warned our Olympic athletes not to speak out against China. And now Russia has launched an unprovoked, full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, an attack on democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Now all Americans must stand united in solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine as they courageously defend their country against Putin's tyranny as they fight for their freedom. But we shouldn't ignore what happened in the run-up to Putin's invasion, waiving sanctions on Russian pipelines while eliminating oil production here at home, focusing on political correctness rather than military readiness, reacting to world events instead of driving them. Weakness on the world stage has a cost, and the president's approach to foreign policy has consistently been too little, too late. It's time for America to once again project confidence. It's time to be decisive. It's time to lead. But we can't project strength abroad if we're weak at home. And that's what I want to discuss with you tonight. The president and Democrats in Congress have spent the last year either ignoring the issues facing Americans or making them worse. They were warned that spending trillions would lead to soaring inflation. They were told that their anti-energy policies would send gas prices to new heights, but they plowed ahead anyway, raising the price at the pump by 50% and pushing inflation to a 40-year high. 4 decades ago, when our nation was last reeling from inflation, I was a young working mom just starting out. My husband, Kevin, worked days while I watched our girls, and then we would literally switch. We would pass in the yard as he was coming home, and I was leaving to work evenings at the local grocery store. From across that checkout counter, I saw the pain of inflation on my neighbors' faces. I saw what happens when prices rise faster than wages. The Biden administration believes inflation is a, quote, high-class problem. I can tell you, it's an everybody problem. I saw moms and dads' paychecks buy them less and less. I watched working people choose which essentials to take home and which ones to leave behind. And now President Biden's decisions have a whole new generation feeling that same pain. When I took the oath of office 5 years ago, I promised Iowans that I would never lose sight of who I was working for, that I wouldn't become detached from the problems they were facing, from the problems that I had faced myself. But you don't have to check groceries to see what high inflation does to people. You just need to step outside of the DC bubble. Talk to Americans about what's on their mind. Ask them, what are your concerns? What keeps you up at night? And they'll tell you. And I can tell you what's not on that list. They won't tell you that spending trillions more and bankrupting their children is the answer to their problems. They won't tell you that we should be paying people not to work. And they certainly won't tell you that we should give billions in tax giveaways to millionaires and billionaires in Democrat-controlled states like California, New York, and New Jersey. But that's what the Biden administration has been pushing for over the last year. And that's all part of Build Back Better. Thankfully, the president's agenda didn't pass because even members of his own party said enough is enough. Well, the American people share that view. Enough is enough. And it's not just with DC spending. Americans are tired of a political class trying to remake this country into a place where an elite few tell everyone else what they can and cannot say, what they can and cannot believe. They're tired of people pretending the way to end racism is by categorizing everybody by their race. They're tired of politicians who tell parents they should sit down, be silent, and let government control their kids' education and future. Frankly, they are tired of the theater, where politicians do one thing when the cameras are rolling and another when they believe you can't see them, where governors and mayors enforce mandates but don't follow them, where elected leaders tell their citizens to stay home while they sneak off to Florida for sun and fun, where they demand that your child wear a mask, but they go maskless. So you've heard the excuses. They were just holding their breath, but it's the American people who are waiting to exhale, waiting for the insanity to stop. We now live in a country where violent crime is out of control. Liberal prosecutors are letting criminals off easy, and many prominent Democrats still want to defund the police. You know, it seems like everything is backwards. The Biden administration requires vaccines for Americans who want to go to work or protect this country, but not for migrants who illegally cross the border. The Department of Justice treats parents like domestic terrorists, but looters and shoplifters roam free. The American people are left to feel like they're the enemy. This is not the same country it was a year ago. The president tried to paint a different picture tonight, but his actions over the last 12 months don't match the rhetoric. It's not what he promised when he took office. But it doesn't have to be that way. There is an alternative. Across the nation, Republican governors and legislators are showing Americans what conservative leadership looks like, what it means to respect the people we serve, to hear them out, to stand up for them and walk alongside them. We know that our problems require bold action, but we also know that bold action doesn't have to mean government action. It's Americans making their own decisions for their own families and future. Republican governors face the same COVID-19 virus head-on. But we honored your freedoms and saw right away that lockdowns and school closures, they came with their own significant cost, that mandates weren't the answer. And we actually listened to the science, especially with kids in masks and kids in schools. What happened and is still happening to our children over the last 2 years is unconscionable. Learning loss, isolation, anxiety, depression. In so many states, our kids have been left behind, and so many will never catch up. That's why Iowa was the first state in the nation to require that schools open their doors. I was attacked by the left, I was attacked by the media, but it wasn't a hard choice. It was the right choice. And keeping schools open is only the start of the pro-parent, pro-family revolution that Republicans are leading in Iowa and states across this country. Republicans believe that parents matter. It was true before the pandemic, and it has never been more important to say out loud. Parents matter. They have a right to know and to have a say in what their kids are being taught. Families also have every right to live in a safe and a secure community. And that begins with a safe and secure country. But the Biden administration has refused to secure our border. They've refused to provide the resources to stop human trafficking, to stop the staggering influx of deadly drugs coming into our neighborhoods. They've refused to protect you. With Texas and Arizona leading the way, I, along with Republican governors from several states, have sent resources to the border. And we've actually gone to the border, something that our president and vice president have yet to do since taking office. On the economy, the contrast couldn't be more stark. While Democrats in D.C. are spending trillions, sending inflation soaring, Republican leaders around the country are balancing budgets and cutting taxes because we know that money spent on Main Street is better than money spent on bureaucracy. Today, I signed legislation that eliminates Iowa's tax on retirement income and sets our tax rate at 3.9%. That's less than half of what it was just 4 years ago. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that out of the top 20 states with the lowest unemployment rates, 17 have Republican governors. Republicans may not have the White House, but we're doing what we can to fill the leadership vacuum. And on the issues that are affecting Americans, Republicans are leading. We're standing up for parents and kids. We're standing up for life. We're keeping our communities safe and thanking those in uniform. We're fighting to restore America's energy independence, and that includes biofuels. We're getting people back to work, not paying them to stay home. Most of all, we're respecting your freedom. Behind me stands Iowa's Capitol, where we display our state motto, our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain. And those aren't just empty words. It's a belief that the greatness of this state and this country lies in our people, not government. You shouldn't have to wake up every morning and worry about the next thing the government is going to do to you, your business, or your children. If we as elected leaders are doing our job, then the government is working well, but operating in the background. It's supporting the ingenuity and spirit of our people, not drowning them out. It's keeping them safe, not restricting their freedom. That's what I believe, that's what Republicans believe, and that's what Republicans are doing. I am so blessed to be the governor of Iowa, where people are humble, hardworking, and patriotic. We take care of each other. And yes, we are, as they say, Iowa nice. But you don't have to be from Iowa to see that those are the values of America at its best, all of America. Over the last few years, I've put my faith in Iowans, and they haven't let me down. I encourage this president to do the same, to put his faith in you, the American people, who have never wavered in your belief in this country, regardless of who leads it. Because you know, you've shown that the soul of America isn't about who lives in the White House. It's men and women like you in every corner of this nation who are willing to step up and take responsibility for your communities, for your neighbors, and ultimately for yourselves. By that most important measure at least, the state of our union is indeed strong. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Well, at least she and Joe Biden agree on that. That was Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds in Des Moines. And we're going to go right now to Representative Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan. She is delivering remarks on behalf of the Working Families Party. Let's take a listen.
Country, city of Detroit. I am honored to be with all of you tonight to elevate the voices of our families and our communities across the country that continue to be left behind. As the mother of 2 boys and the eldest of 14 children, I have been taking care of people all my life. My service in Congress is guided by my roots. That's why I'm committed to standing up for our communities that just want the opportunity to thrive. In the richest country in the world, it shouldn't be this hard for so many to have a good life. Tonight, I am proud to deliver a response on behalf of the Working Families Party. The Working Families Party is a voice for the multiracial working class, fighting for a nation that cares for all of us. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I'm also part of the Working Families Party because I believe that our government must put the needs of working families first. In difficult times, we must never lose sight of each other's humanity. 2 years ago, we couldn't have imagined a pandemic that has taken nearly 1 million lives here at home and nearly 6 million across the world. It also threw tens of millions of Americans, our neighbors, out of work, and it exposed our inhumane, profit-driven healthcare system as our essential workers were pushed to the breaking point and hospitals ran out of beds. When President Biden took office just over a year ago, he took action. He started getting shots in arms. He acted quickly to deliver emergency relief. Congress approved direct relief checks. We helped our working parents. We stopped evictions. We sent resources to our schools and our local and state governments. We showed the potential of an administration and Congress that can act together at the scale of the challenges we all face. We showed how our government can be in the service of the working class majority, not just the wealthy few. And it worked. President Biden and Congress stopped what could have been an economic freefall. Not a single Republican, not one, voted for the relief package. We created 6 million new jobs, and I am inspired to see empowered workers demanding fair wages, stronger benefits, and human dignity. After the emergency response, we had a chance to do so much more. So when President Biden laid out the visionary Build Back Better agenda to create an America where we all have an opportunity to thrive, people got excited. We had a chance to begin to address decades of rising inequality and injustice. President Biden's Build Back Better brought people together. We saw for the first time people who want to see childcare in the same room with those combating climate change. Folks working on housing justice in the same room as those working on health care. The President did that. Build Back Better did that. Build Back Better increases access to health care and lowers prescription drug cost. It funds home and community-based care for our
And we're going to pop out of Representative Tlaib's response to President Biden's address. You know, couldn't be further apart from Governor Reynolds, you know, praising Build Back Better and lamenting that it didn't get done. I think it does highlight a little bit the political difficulty of being president right now when, you know, even in a moment where there's a war in Ukraine, the president is getting bipartisan applause on that topic. The official Republican response gives him no credit, no nod to any of that, doesn't mention it. And then on the other side, you get, you know, whacked by a member of the base of your own party who isn't really going after you, but is still, you know, not content to just let things lie with your own, let you speak for the party. Well, got to speak to your own constituency. It's, you know, not easy.
No, I mean, for Democrats, like, this is not a good look. It's like, you know, they should have one message, not two, and there'll be a third message shortly after this. So, no, that doesn't look good. In terms of the Republican response, it was notable that Governor Reynolds, she really gave President Biden no credit for what's going on in Ukraine. And it's a contrast to Republican leaders. If you've seen some of the statements that McCarthy's made, McConnell made, while they criticize him on plenty of other things, in this narrow case, they've really just gone after Putin and have avoided criticizing President Biden.
Yeah, I mean, it's not totally unprecedented for us to see, you know, members of a party splinter off and have their own sort of response. Obviously, the Tea Party was one of those sort of subsets that felt a need to respond to the response, if you will. I think
Bernie Sanders, too, a couple of years back,
exactly.
Progressive response.
We're seeing more of this. Now, I don't know if that's going to mean that we're going to eventually have more than just a two-party system, which the forefathers warned us about will lead us to this place anyway. Not sure. We see how the political money works out, but I think it is healthy to have debate. I'm not one of those, you know, thinkers who believe that parties have to coalesce around its leaders and never veer from that. I know that's President Reagan's thing. God bless the Republicans for doing that. But I think a healthier democracy is one in which debate takes place. That's what the forefathers wanted. That's the reason why it's so hard to pass laws, because they want us to have these debates. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that the Democrats have a response to the State of the Union. I think what is bad is the fact that from this panel here, from people that I've been texting in and out of DC, and from other grassroots leaders that I've been texting as well, is that the message that was delivered by President Biden was a weak one. That's the issue, not the rebuttal or not the expansion of it, but the fact the initial message didn't hit home for anyone.
Do you think that, I mean, as you were listening to Kim Reynolds talk and really go after him, I mean, a lot of the same sort of cultural grievances that we've heard for a long time from the Republican Party, but, you know, really seemed like they were trying to take advantage of what they see to be an opening on education issue around
Absolutely.
COVID, and on obviously the cost of living. And you know, Joe Biden, in the middle of the speech when he was making a case for his agenda, there was a lot on sort of the same populist economics that he was articulating when he was trying to get Build Back Better to move, which is we need to raise taxes on corporations and the wealthy. We need to make the economy fairer. And you know, so that's Democratic argument, Democratic brand of populism. And then you have on the Republican side, I mean, what did you make of what she was saying? And you know, I don't expect that you agreed with much of it, but do you feel like she sensed some weakness and was trying to capitalize on areas where the president may have some liabilities?
Well, I think the Republicans in general do a very good job of taking a message, coalescing behind it, and repeating it, whether that message is true or not. You know,
right.
I mean, I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean, it's an effective tool for them, whether the information they're saying is true or not. Remember when President Obama initially was trying to pass the Affordable Care Act? The first thing we heard were death panels, and death panels became such a huge part of the Republican message that the Democrats who didn't have a death panel had to explain that. So it was manufacturing an argument and then forcing Democrats to respond to it. And I think when it comes to the education factor, that's part of the same sort of game plan. There are no schools in this country, as far as I've been reporting on this, that are teaching CRT to 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds. There's no school in this nation that's doing that. But facts don't matter. The message is good. The message is working. And it got one man elected governor, right?
Haven't heard a lot about CRT ever since that Virginia governor's race.
Haven't heard a lot about that.
No.
But the idea that we can take elements of that campaign and put it, to your point, to the Democrats' face and use it as a way to weaponize it, if you will, whether it's true or not, I think it's a very effective tool, and Democrats need to find a way to counteract that. They haven't been very successful in the last few elections, but they need to if they think they're going to have any chance of keeping the Senate.
Well, I think like that message was aimed clearly at suburban women, the voters who used to call soccer moms, who in, for example, 2016 in Orange County, they took the longtime conservative bastion of Orange County and turned it blue. And these women are they're very influential. How they vote in the midterms is going to affect who controls Congress. And a lot of these women have had a really bad 2 years working from home, trying to help their kids do their Zoom. There's palpable frustration. All of my friends who have kids, regardless of what part of the political spectrum they are, there was a lot of frustration of what they've had to do for the last couple of years, and that message seemed clearly aimed at them.
I think clearly so, and I think that is probably a big reason why Governor Reynolds was the choice to deliver this year's response. I think her not mentioning Ukraine, right? The official Republican response, that is a partisan response. And so not mentioning Ukraine, probably a recognition that, yeah, that's
lost that one.
That's positive terrain for the president right now.
Right.
We're just going to let that go. I want to go back to that topic, though, the topic of Ukraine, and bring in another guest, and that is Kimberly St. Julian Varnon. She is a specialist in Russian, Soviet, and Ukrainian history at the University of Pennsylvania. Kimberly, welcome. Thank you for waiting to join us here. I want to just ask you for your reaction so far to the top of the speech where the president focused on the crisis in Ukraine. What did you think?
I think it was emotionally powerful, but it wasn't what I was looking for as a specialist on the region. So I think we saw the Ukrainian colors, we saw the Ukrainian flag, and all of those images are very powerful. But I'm concerned about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now. We saw this rhetoric, and Biden was praising how Ukrainians were putting themselves in front of tanks, and how Putin thought he would shake the foundations of the free world, but Putin didn't understand the Ukrainian people. And I think this is great, and we should definitely celebrate the defense that the Ukrainians have put up so far. But we should also remember, and this is missing in President Biden's speech, Ukraine is still fighting this war alone. And we've seen some really, terrible images coming from Kharkiv and Kiev, where Putin is trying to flatten these cities. We also have a major refugee crisis on the borders of Poland and Hungary. We've seen videos of African students and Indian students being turned away from the border due to issues of racism. So we have a humanitarian crisis we need to be addressing at the border, but also there's a humanitarian crisis going on inside of Ukraine right now with a shortage of medicine and a shortage of food. And so I heard about in the State of the Union, President Biden talked about how united NATO was and united the West was in maintaining our democratic institutions. But the response we've seen in Ukraine is a lot of infighting within NATO and within the EU with trying to figure out the sanctions package, trying to figure out how to deal with SWIFT and Russia's place in that. So I think rhetorically, it was a very good speech. But what I was looking for were concrete analyses, or at least concrete statements about what we have done in Ukraine and what we have done for Ukraine. But most of all, what are we going to do for Ukraine when there's a 40-mile convoy heading its way?
Yeah, it did feel like there was, a lot of what the president was saying on Ukraine was dictated. It was geared toward an American audience, a domestic audience, reassuring Americans that there won't be boots on the ground. He said, "We're going to be okay," and he didn't say Ukraine is going to be okay. He said, "We're going to be okay," reassuring Americans that he'll do what he can about, rising costs as a result of the war. I think, you make that point, and it's a strong one. I'm interested in what you are hearing from your contacts who are in Ukraine right now. I understand you've been helping some students who are stranded there.
Yes, the situation is dire across Ukraine. I got messages this morning of a large group of foreign students in Sumy, near the northeastern border with Russia, Ukraine, who didn't have food. And this is something that we're seeing throughout Ukraine, are shortages of food, shortages of water. And because of the Russian onslaught, it's very difficult for people to find supplies. And so while I'm happy President Biden addressed the American people, and if we're going to continue helping to fund Ukraine, they will need more money for more aid. So we'll have to have this conversation again with Congress. And I think addressing the dire situation that Ukraine is in could make this process a little bit easier later, when he's having to explain why we're sending further aid to Ukraine, other than the $350 million we've already spent.
It does feel, though, like the emotional appeals from President Zelensky, and I think a week's worth of images on Americans' television screens, seeing these cities getting shelled, seeing people with children hiding out in subways below the ground. It does feel like that has really galvanized not just a U.S. response, but a unified response across Europe. I mean, to see Germany moving and adjusting its defense spending, to see Switzerland breaking its tradition of neutrality, to see Sweden and Finland talking about potential NATO membership. I mean, it does seem like even if they were late to kind of get together, and if some of these talks were contentious, for a long time behind the scenes trying to figure out the sanctions, it seems like the reality of the actual conflict has snapped the West to attention, maybe more efficiently than people thought. Has that been your impression?
Absolutely. And especially coming from the region and working on the region and kind of waiting to see what the response is going to be for the past 2 or 3 weeks. So I do think the invasion and the brutality of the Russian invasion, the horrible scenes we're seeing, and civilians being killed, little children being killed. I mean, it's hard for any person, across the world to ignore these scenes. But I also hope we continue to focus on Ukraine and be concerned for Ukraine, because this is not over. This is literally day 5 or day 6. This is the beginning. And so we have to really, focus on that and continue to think about that, even if we aren't necessarily seeing these victorious images out of Ukraine that we've seen so far.
And I know you've also been concerned about conditions at the Polish border, especially, as you mentioned already, for Black and brown refugees. Can you tell us about the difficulty some of those people have been having getting out of Ukraine?
So it's been harrowing across the Polish border in particular, because you have wait times of up to 20 hours. And so what we're seeing, and these videos are very popular on social media, but I've been in contact with some of these students, is if you don't have any type of embassy or consulate in Ukraine or in Poland in particular, it's very hard to get across the border. And so the waits are hard, but also African students have talked about being harassed by people on the border, particularly Ukrainian and Polish border guards. And so it's really harrowing. And what I think we're seeing, I mean, these are forms of racism, and racism is not unique to the United States. Ukraine and Poland, Hungary, throughout Eastern Europe, they've had problems with anti-Black racism, anti-Roma racism. So we're seeing the culmination of this. But this isn't new. If just in December, we saw similar pictures and similar videos on the border between Belarus and Poland with Syrian refugees. So this is just compounding this refugee crisis, particularly of Black and Brown refugees that we saw in December. So I think this is something that we really have to address. And even just the United States coming out and discussing these issues, the Biden administration discussing these issues, kind of having that moral leadership could really be a boon and could help these students who are trapped at the border.
Yeah, we'll see where that conversation goes. And this is an administration that has said it would raise the refugee cap, but hasn't raised it as high as a lot of people had hoped they would. And we'll see if this situation and the crisis that it may create alters the administration's thinking a little bit on that. Professor Kimberly St. Julian Varnon at the University of Pennsylvania, expert on Russian, Soviet, and Ukrainian history. We're really glad to have you as part of our conversation tonight. Thanks for joining us and staying up late.
Thank you for having me.
It's really, you know, I know that the people in the White House who were writing the speech did not necessarily know that this would be the situation when the president's giving the State of the Union. In fact, some people, I think, thought that Ukraine would have already fallen to Russia at this point. But, you know, this is all really still sort of hanging in the balance for not, you know, it's crass to talk about this as a political story for Washington, for the president. This is a matter of life and death in Eastern Europe. And, you know, I do wonder, the West has seemed to have had so far a very unified and strong reaction. I mean, when you see Germany willing to stop Nord Stream 2, and when you see Europe, you know, completely and altogether institute a no-fly zone, I mean, you know, this is a strong...
Switzerland, I mean... This
is a very strong response, and yet they haven't really gone after the energy markets. So you still see people reacting to, I think, the moral clarity of what's going on and right versus wrong. But at the same time, there are domestic considerations in all of these countries. There's a reason Germany was reluctant to, you know, go as far as kicking them out of SWIFT or not, you know, ultimately they went and shut down Nord Stream 2. There's a reason the Allies have not slapped sanctions on Russian energy companies. And I'd just be interested in sort of your thoughts on, you know, how the West and how this administration in particular are trying to balance, you know, backing up their rhetoric about democracy while at the same time keeping an eye on their domestic politics.
That's why foreign policy is so unpredictable and such a challenge, even in normal times when, you know, you didn't have one country invading another. But I mean, that's a real challenge for the president, because we don't know what this is going to look like in November. Is this? I think you're right that a lot of people thought, you know, that Kiev would fall days ago, and it hasn't. And you know, I think, you know, people watching these videos, it's, you know, it's been sort of it's been inspiring to see Ukrainians standing up, you know, against the Russians. But Russia has a lot of military, and it's like how long can people continue to, you know? And then also, if this spills into another country, if this somehow impacts other Europeans, I mean, it could get a lot more complicated.
Yeah. What have you been thinking about as you watch this? I'm sure you've been watching a lot of the coverage as well.
You know, it's kind of been like this wide-ranging sort of conversation. And Terry Tang and I, who's my editor for Op-Ed, and I had a conversation this weekend. And I said to her, I said, if you're Vladimir Putin, if you're President Putin, and one of your Olympic athletes was found guilty of having performance-enhancing drugs in the midst of the Olympics, and the West can't get their act together to expel the swimmer for violating the IOC's rules, that's an easy lift, right? That's simple, right? Like, you busted, you're cheating, you should be gone. Easy. The West couldn't do that, right? So if you're Vladimir Putin and you've already invaded Georgia under W, you've annexed Crimea, you've had multiple violations in terms of athletics and sports and the IOC. We finally saw FIFA step up. We're waiting to see if the ATP and WTA join in. We'll see about that. But I know it sounds trivial, but small things build up to large things. Those were small things that have been adding up. And now here we are, what I think is a very dire situation. You talk about impacting other European countries. I've been thinking about Estonia this entire time, because then we really are going to see what the resolve is.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure if I want to see the end result of that resolve. because thus far, I don't know how you feel about it, but it is complicated. And as a result, I don't think that we, as a collective West, have done enough to thoroughly deter Vladimir Putin from wanting to try to reclaim Mother Russia the way that he thinks it should be.
Well, I think, I mean, if he goes into Estonia or any other NATO country and then it turns into American soldiers being involved, then that's going to totally change it.
NATO membership, yeah.
Right. Which is why I was so shocked, and I was talking about this earlier, that there was so much going on in the speech in terms of domestic policies that he just wanted to see pass through. And I was like, we just spent the past week wondering if we're going to World War III. That just seems like a bigger conversation to me than the first 10 to 15 minutes of a 1-hour speech.
Well, and there was no, there's been a lot of chatter around the White House this week about nuclear weapons and Putin's threat and the fact that the sanctions and the back and forth, if this is sort of tit for tat escalating, what does Putin do next? And Putin has already made a not very subtle threat to remind the world that he possesses a whole lot of missiles with nuclear warheads. And that was, I understand why a president doesn't want to have to reassure people about nuclear weapons in a speech, partly because you can't promise that Vladimir Putin is not that crazy. But that was not part of the speech. And, you could make a case that the remarks on Ukraine did not necessarily reflect the gravity of the situation in this moment. Even though you could feel it in the room, you could see people with the flags, you could feel the bipartisan applause, and his rhetoric was strong, and there was no ambiguity about what he was saying about which side the United States is on. But again, when you're spending so much time reassuring Americans that don't worry, we don't really have any skin in the game beyond your gas prices might go up a little bit, but don't worry, that's going to be it.
It wasn't a good spin to me. It just simply wasn't, based upon the reporting and the news that we were getting out of Europe in terms of how this conflict was quickly escalating. I went back this weekend to listen to JFK's first State of the Union because I thought that this situation in terms of Europe and the Ukraine was very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And so I was just curious as to what the president was saying leading up to that moment. And one of the things I was struck by was how honest he was in terms of the actual state of the union. During JFK's initial State of the Union, the country was facing a terrible recession. Obviously, there was war all around. There was a lot of instability. And he talked about it in detail about this is where we are. This is what we're going to need to do to get out of it. And we're going to need sacrifices from all Americans in order to do it. It was a very succinct sort of speech. Now, obviously, the climate today is very different than what it is today, and it's going to be very hard to tell Americans to sacrifice and, obviously lay out what the issues are in this country in really stark detail. But I felt that President Biden could have leaned into more detail at least so that we are better informed and that we aren't wearing these rosy-colored Western glasses that thinks that, oh, well, that's okay now. We've wrapped this up. Mission accomplished. Now we can move on. We've done mission accomplished. We know what happens when we underestimate the complexities of international politics.
Well, and I think, President Biden was, in the speech, explicit about President Putin underestimated the, durability, the resolve of NATO, of the West. For good reason. To your point, he suspected that alliance, those bonds had frayed, that the countries were not as committed to, shoring up their own defenses, that there were obviously, problems, domestic problems in the United States, problems that he had a hand in exacerbating. And yet, there's been a lot of talk, and people that I've spoken to who have said, better late than never from Europe to get it together. But it really, I think, did take seeing him, and we can talk about why seeing him take a little piece of Georgia and take Crimea and nip around the edges of the old Soviet Union, why that wasn't enough of a wake-up call in years past. Why Ukraine, their NATO membership in 2008 when they applied, why it didn't go anywhere. And, the reason probably has to do with follow the money from Russia and the energy resources and all of that. And it's a more complicated situation than we can get into here. But, I think that whatever the reasons were that this has been a slow dawning realization, when you see Vladimir Putin send, right, 190,000 troops on the border, and then they go in and you see missiles raining down on these cities. It feels like it just, right, it was long overdue, but it felt like that was what it took to snap the alliance and a lot of these democratic powers into, crisis mode. That was the wake-up call. And I don't, and certainly there's room going forward for, I would say, for the alliance to
do you think there was like a false sense of security in Europe that, that even if they didn't like him, that he was contained and that he really wouldn't mess with like the rest of them, and that once this happened, this actually made people realize like, oh, this is a real problem.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was always a hypothetical and one that sure that could happen, but I think it was one that they thought was mostly contained, or they thought it was one that they would hope was contained so that countries could continue to utilize Russian energy. I mean, it's no small thing for Germany to shut that pipeline down because and this administration, one of the things that we've noted and that others have noted is, you think of President Trump sort of shoving the Montenegro president out of the way at his first G7 because he needed to be in front, right? That's sort of a photo op, that's symbolic. But this is a president who in this huge moment has deferred in many ways to Europe, to European leaders, to let Germany announce the announcement on Nord Stream 2, to let them go first, to make sure they're all in a line before announcing that Washington is doing this with or without you. I think part of that reflects a lesson that they learned from doing Afghanistan and the withdrawal so unilaterally. But I think,
also, they can't set this can't be set up as U.S. versus Russia.
Exactly. But there is strength in numbers here, and I just think that the ally management is a place where, we heard Republicans give them some credit for that, before the speech when we were talking to them.
He deserves it.
But that is an area where they have held this alliance together and strengthened it. And again, I think Vladimir Putin strengthened it more than anyone. But it's not easy. It's not easy to arrive at this position that is going to hurt your own domestic economy.
Right. Especially if you're not willing to tell people that sacrifices are going to be needed in a significant way in order to do that.
And if you think we're sacrificing, people here are paying more for gas. The U.S., I think 7% of the imported energy is from Russia. It's a whole lot more across the Atlantic Ocean. Europe is heavily reliant. And so for them to do this, I think, is no small thing. And I think that the administration understood that from the start. And this has just been a much more coordinated response.
President Biden has obviously been on the scene for decades, and he specialized in foreign policy. And that was one of the things, on the campaign trail that he always made the case about how he's known these world leaders forever. And so I think this does, his handling of it does speak to having that kind of background.
Yeah. We are just sitting here discussing this, and it's a great conversation. We are waiting for one final guest, and she is almost in place, so we are looking forward to chatting with Democratic Representative Barbara Lee. She will be with us in just a moment, and then we will bring this live stream to a close. But, there is just so much to cover. To get back to sort of where we started right after the speech, it's still kind of hard to know what the headline is off that speech. We talk about all these things. There's so much going on in the world. Ukraine, there's war in Europe. There's still a pandemic. There are, economic issues across the country, and it's I don't know that he gave us a headline.
I think it's a speech that has a headline that basically says Ukraine, and then the subhead is Democrat agenda, and is everything else, which in my opinion is a significant turnoff to the young voters who came out for him in 2020. And more importantly, the more liberal side of his party. When he started having the conversations about defunding the police versus funding the police without any mention of any of the other aspects of the policy that got people to vote for him, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in those hallways starting tomorrow.
The other thing with the pandemic response, that's another dangerous area because there have been so many periods during the pandemic when we all thought, okay, we've got our vaccinations, it's all over, and it's and then we've had with the different variants, et cetera. So that's another thing. We have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, and the president, after he got a lot of flack for in July declaring our independence from the virus, and there are 2 new variants. So tonight he said we're in a new moment in the fight against COVID-19. Made a show of not needing to come in a mask. He didn't walk in wearing one, but he did caution. Can't promise there won't be any additional variants coming. Let's bring in Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Democratic representative from California. Thank you for taking some time to join us. I know it's been a long day, and you are 3 hours later than we are here in California. So thank you for getting in front of the computer. Just let's start. What's your reaction? What did you think of the speech tonight?
Well, generally, I thought it was probably one of the best speeches that we've heard in recent years. I think the president was very firm, very strong, but also very compassionate. He spoke to the American people. And he also spoke to what was taking place in Ukraine in terms of the support for the Ukrainian people, but also how democracy is going to definitely win. And this is really, in Ukraine, it's a fight to determine whether democracy or autocracy is going to win. And he was very clear about what is taking place in Ukraine. Also, he was very clear about supporting the Ukrainian people with the humanitarian support and refugee assistance. I chair the subcommittee that funds a lot of what he talked about tonight. So on the global front, I think he was excellent. And then when he talked about the economy, growing it from the bottom up, even though we have record numbers in terms of job numbers, in terms of unemployment rates, in terms of wages, still people are suffering. People are feeling the pain of inflation. He talked about the supply chain being broken and the reasons why the cost of living is so high. And so that's why we've got to pass, for example, Build Back Better and some of the provisions in there. And he talked about reducing the cost of prescription drugs. And also in terms of those who need insulin, a ceiling of $35. And so he spoke to the needs and aspirations of the American people. And finally, I think he talked about the progress we've made. I mean, this administration has done wonders. I mean, they came in with a pandemic before them. They moved the vaccinations out quickly. They made sure testing was available. And, there were some bumps in the road, but they were determined to save lives and livelihoods. And so he did. And I think it was the important thing to do, lay out what we've done, what he's done, what his administration has done. He did not dwell on that, said we have to move forward, but he certainly laid out, because a lot of times you hear Democrats don't talk about what they've done. But I think he did a very good job in doing that and moving forward what he intends to do in the future.
Congresswoman Lee, I'm curious as to how do you believe the section of the speech where he talked about funding the police, how do you think that plays towards the more liberal aspect of the Democratic Party? And more importantly, what does that say to the young people who marched in the streets believing that there was going to be police reform, criminal justice reform, and instead they hear about funding the police more?
Well, I tell you, one thing in terms of the defund the police message, that's a message that has been very difficult to address in terms of the real issues about reforming the police, putting resources on the front end for real public safety for Black and brown communities. And so that's important. And I wish he would have expanded on that and talked about how we want to make sure we have public safety for everyone and would put more resources into crime prevention, into making sure police officers were held accountable. And I wanted to hear him talk about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which of course got stuck because Republicans could not vote for it. And so the balancing act, I don't think he balanced it quite enough, because we definitely should have talked more about why we need to have more resources to make communities that up until this point have not been safe, because we all want safety, but we want it done in a way that is truly equal and truly truly ensures that the police officers are held accountable for any crimes that they commit. And that's what George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was about.
Congresswoman, you talked about what Democrats have done. Obviously, there are some achievements, infrastructure, the American Rescue Plan, potentially in a matter of weeks, a historic new justice on the Supreme Court. But obviously, there are a lot of things that are unfinished, voting rights, police reform, Build Back Better. We don't know what is going to come of that and whether or not any of it's going to get sort of put back together again. I guess the question for you is, at this point, do Democrats really have enough to run on in the fall as things are at the moment? And, is that going to be enough to excite the base that came out in 2020 to vote for Joe Biden and Democrats?
Yeah, I think we have to communicate very clearly the reality of what the politics are, first of all. I mean, Democrats, we have the House, the Senate, and the White House. And yet we could not pass Build Back Better or voting rights because of two Democrats. But all of the Republicans would vote no. And so we've got to explain that Republicans are holding up a heck of a lot of the president's agenda. And we have to be honest and tell the truth. But having said that, when you look at what has happened in terms of what we have done, we have to communicate to the public. People, record numbers of people are working now. We had a moratorium on evictions. I mean, we have to talk about what saved their lives and their livelihoods. So I think it's more about how we communicate to people the unfinished business, because it will have been 2 years come November that we have to complete. But voting rights, I mean, this is the essence of our democracy. Republicans all should vote for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act. I mean, it's not just those two Democrats, it's the Republicans. And so we have to be clear that this is the Biden agenda, and he's fighting hard every day to get it passed and tell the truth to constituents. I think authenticity and truth-telling is what is going to help us win these elections.
Well, several months to go, and certainly a lot of fluidity in the United States and around the world. We're going to keep watching it. Appreciate the work you're doing on Ukraine and other matters, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight at the end of a very busy day in Washington. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
With you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you. Before we say goodnight, I feel like we've talked around all these things, but any final thoughts from either of you before we say goodnight?
I just don't know who this speech, who it would have moved. I mean, or did the speech change anybody's mind on any other party, on either side of so many of these issues? I mean, I'm not sure what it accomplished, and I'm sure they'll be polling, and we'll find out more about that. But right now, I'm not exactly sure what.
We will, and I felt that way watching him at the White House. There are a lot of these teleprompter speeches. They all kind of do sound the same. The audience for a speech like this is far greater than people who are watching Joe Biden speak from the state dining room at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. But it wasn't necessarily a whole lot of new stuff or stuff that will break through in this media environment.
No, it wasn't. And honestly, I can't tell you what President Obama said in his first State of the Union.
Right.
I don't know what George W. Bush said. I can't remember what Ronald Reagan said, Jimmy Carter, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember what they did. I remember what was accomplished. And so now that he's had this first State of the Union address, now it's about trying to accomplish as much of his agenda as much as possible. And, obviously everything really teeters on what happens in Europe with the Ukraine anyway. So we're giving him the business tonight. I promise you, next week, we probably won't even think about the State of the Union address.
Or tomorrow.
Or tomorrow.
Well, we're going to get off the set. You can call the president back, because I know he blew up your cell a little while ago, so you can have it out with him off camera. But that is going to do it for us tonight. Thank you to both of you, Seema, LZ, for being with us. This was the State of the Union live stream from the Los Angeles Times, live in El Segundo. I'm Eli Stokols. One last thank you to our panelists, again, Seema Mehta and LZ Granderson, Gustavo Arellano earlier, and to all of our guests who joined us this evening. And thank you again for being with us. Good night.